Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst, quite literally, into the magnificent, messy, and often mind-boggling world of medieval royal feasts. Imagine, if you will, a hall bursting with more food than you've ever seen, the air thick with the smell of roasting meats, exotic spices, and probably a fair bit of unwashed nobility. You're there, a goblet of wine in hand, trying to look like you belong, while a whole roasted peacock, feathers and all, stares blankly at you from the centre of the table. It's a world of incredible indulgence and strict rules, and honestly, with the questionable hygiene and the sheer g-forces of medieval digestion, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I'd love to see you post your location and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're mending a slightly frayed tapestry in your solar, the afternoon sun slanting through the arrow-slit window, when the sound of urgent hooves clattering on the cobblestones of your small courtyard yanks you from your reverie. It's not the usual relaxed pace of a merchant or a returning servant. This has an official, almost aggressive rhythm, peeking through the thick greenish glass of the window pane, a luxury in itself. You see him. A rider dismounting from a lathered horse, his livery unmistakable, the king's own crimson gold. Your heart does a little tap dance against your ribs, a peculiar mix of something like pride and a definite dollop of dread. Royal messengers don't just pop by for a cup of mead and a chat. He doesn't knock so much as announce his presence with a firm rap of his riding crop against your sturdy oak door. Your steward, a man usually unflappable, practically sprints to answer it, his face a mixture of awe and anxiety. You hear the low murmur of voices, the messenger's tone clipped and authoritative, your steward's almost embarrassingly subservient. Then silence, followed by the steward's hesitant steps approaching your chamber. He enters, eyes wide, holding a roll of parchment with the kind of reverence usually reserved for holy relics. "My lord lady," he breathes, "a missive. From the king." He extends it towards you, and you take it, noticing the surprising weight. It's not flimsy paper, but thick creamy parchment, rolled tightly and bound with a silken cord, and there, pressed into a disc of deep red wax, is the king's personal seal, an intricate design of a lion rampant, or perhaps a falcon in flight, depending on which monarch we're imagining. This seal is everything. In an age where literacy isn't exactly universal, the royal seal was the ultimate mark of authenticity, a visual guarantee that this document and the command it contained came directly from the sovereign. Forging such a seal was, needless to say, a shortcut to a very unpleasant and very public execution. You carefully break the wax, the faint, slightly sweet scent of beeswax and resin momentarily filling the air. The cord unwinds and you unroll the parchment, the smooth, slightly stiff surface cool beneath your fingertips. The script is elaborate, is likely in Latin or Norman French, the courtly languages of the time, written in a flowing, almost ostentatiously beautiful hand. It looks less like writing and more like a family of very artistic spiders decided to have a rave in an ink pot. You squint, tracing the letters with a finger, your own education thankfully sufficient to make sense of the ornate swirls and flourishes. The message, once deciphered, is both an honour and a command. You are graciously invited, or perhaps gently summoned, to attend a feast at the royal palace, or perhaps a favoured hunting lodge, in, say, a fortnight's time. The occasion might be hinted at: the celebration of a recent military victory, the welcoming of a foreign dignitary, or perhaps the king's own saint's day. Whatever the reason, the implication is clear. This is not an invitation you can decline with a polite note saying you're washing your hair that evening. Attendance is mandatory, your presence expected, your absence noted and likely interpreted in the least favourable way imaginable. This is less an RSVP and more of a see you there or else. A shiver, not entirely unpleasant, runs down your spine. A royal feast. The very words conjure images of unparalleled opulence, of tables groaning under the weight of food you can usually only dream of. Roasted swans, peacocks redressed in their plumage, mountains of venison and boar, pastries sculpted into fantastical beasts, and wine, so much wine. It's a chance to see and be seen, to rub shoulders, quite literally given the crowded conditions, with the most powerful people in the kingdom. But alongside the excitement, there's that persistent thrum of anxiety. What will you wear? How must you act? One wrong word, one breach of the incredibly complex etiquette could have unfortunate consequences. It's a social minefield, and you're about to walk it in your best, albeit slightly uncomfortable, shoes. The royal messenger, you recall, had a particularly stoic expression, didn't he? Almost as if he'd personally delivered 1,000 such life-altering parchments and was entirely unmoved by the emotional whiplash they induced. There's a curious tidbit about these royal messengers. They were often granted special protections, almost like diplomatic immunity, allowing them safe passage through lands that might otherwise be hostile. They carried the king's authority with them, and harming a royal messenger was tantamount to attacking the king himself. Some even say that in dire situations, a messenger might be compelled to memorize the message and then eat the parchment to prevent it falling into enemy hands, though this sounds more like something from a spy thriller than a standard operating procedure for party invites. Historians still argue whether the flowery, often obsequious language used in these royal invitations was merely a conventional form of politeness, a sort of medieval boilerplate, or if subtle variations in phrasing and emphasis were intended to convey deeper political messages, unspoken obligations, or even veiled threats to the recipient. Was the king really looking forward to your wise counsel and pleasant company? Or was he just making sure all his important vassals were conveniently gathered in one place where he could keep an eye on them? The ambiguity is part of the charm, and the danger. For now, though, the immediate concern is practical. You need to prepare. Your finest clothes will need to be aired, perhaps even hastily embellished. A suitable gift for the king must be, considered, something impressive but not so ostentatious as to appear to be challenging his own magnificence. And you'll need to mentally rehearse the pleasantries, the bows, the careful compliments. This isn't just a dinner party, it's a performance, a test, and an opportunity. The anticipation is a potent cocktail of excitement, ambition, and a healthy dose of please don't let me spill wine on the queen. You smooth the parchment again, the king's command now a tangible reality in your hands, the start of an adventure into the very heart of medieval power and indulgence. The feasting hall awaits. The feasting hall awaits indeed. But as you mentally sift through your wardrobe, wondering if that fur-trimmed mantle is a bit too ostentatious or, heaven forbid, not ostentatious enough, a larger question begins to bubble up in your mind, like a pot of stew left a little too long on the fire. Why? Why all this fuss? Why does the king, a man who presumably has a kingdom to run, wars to wage and probably a nagging toothache that no court physician can quite fix, decide to throw a party of such epic proportions? It's not just about getting a good meal, not for him, and certainly not for the hundreds, sometimes thousands he invites. Forget modern event planning with digital invitations and catering quotes. This is a state-level operation, consuming resources that could probably fund a small siege. The truth is, these feasts are far more than just an elaborate dinner. They're intricate tapestries woven from threads of power, politics, social obligation, and pure, unadulterated showmanship. For the king, it's a chance to flex. Imagine the medieval equivalent of launching a new spaceship or hosting the Olympics, but with more roasted swan and less spandex. By laying on such a lavish spread, the king is sending a very clear, very public message to everyone, from the highest duke in the land to the nervous foreign ambassador trying to discreetly wipe grease from his chin. The message: look at me, look at my wealth, my resources, my ability to command such plenty. I am powerful, I am stable, I am magnificent. It's a visual deterrent, a way of saying, don't even think about causing trouble, because if I can do this for a dinner party, imagine what my army looks like. The king wasn't just hungry, he was hungry for your undivided attention and awe, and you, as an attendee, are part of that display. Your presence, your finery, your very act of eating his food and drinking his wine subtly reinforces his authority. It's a performance in which everyone plays a part. The king plays the role of the generous, all-powerful provider, and the guests play the role of loyal, appreciative subjects, or suitably impressed foreign dignitaries. This is especially true if there are rival nobles present. The king is not just feeding them, he's reminding them who's top dog, who controls the flow of patronage and favour. Loyalty, in the medieval period, often followed the food. A lord who could provide for his followers, who could feast them generously, was a lord worth following. The king, by feasting his nobles, is essentially re-upping their loyalty subscription. Then there's the pure politics of it all. A grand feast is an unparalleled opportunity for networking, diplomacy, and a bit of light espionage. Seating arrangements alone could speak volumes, a public declaration of who was in favour and who was, perhaps, on the medieval naughty list. Deals could be struck over a shared trencher of bread, alliances forged between sips of spiced wine. You can bet your best pair of pointed shoes that important conversations, both overt and whispered, would be happening all around you. The king and his advisors would be watching, listening, gauging the mood of the room. Who is talking to whom? Who looks discontented? Who's had a little too much hippocras and is letting slip state secrets? It's a far more effective way of gathering intel than sending out spies sometimes. Just get everyone in one room, ply them with good food and drink, and observe. It was the medieval equivalent of a company Christmas party, but with more potential for actual backstabbing, rather than just metaphorical career sabotage. Beyond the hard-nosed politics, there's the social glue aspect. These feasts are a cornerstone of courtly life. They are occasions for celebration, a royal wedding, a birth, a significant religious holiday, or, as mentioned, a glorious victory in battle. Think of the coronation feast of Richard III in 1483. It was a statement of his contested claim to the throne, a lavish spectacle designed to impress and legitimize. These events break the often harsh monotony of medieval existence, at least for the upper crust. They're a chance to see and be seen, to show off your new silk tunic or that dashing way you have of wielding a goblet. For the nobility, it's a vital part of maintaining their own status within the intricate hierarchy of the court. Failing to attend, or attending in shabby attire, could be social suicide. It's a bit like a modern-day red carpet event, but with fewer photographers and a much higher chance of tripping over a hunting dog gnawing on a bone under the table. Symbolically, the medieval feast is also deeply significant. The king, by providing such abundance, often mirrors the idea of a divine provider. The sheer variety and quantity of food, especially the rare and exotic items, demonstrated his control over the natural world, his ability to command resources from far and wide. The feast itself could be seen as a microcosm of a well-ordered kingdom, hierarchical, with everyone in their proper place, all partaking of the king's bounty. Historians still argue whether the perceived wastefulness of medieval feasts was a deliberate political strategy designed to awe and intimidate, or simply a reflection of aristocratic culture where conspicuous consumption was the norm and a sign of good lordship. Perhaps it was a bit of both, a cultural expectation that also served a very useful political purpose, and sometimes the symbolism got really, really weird. Take the cockentress, for instance, a culinary creation where the front half of a suckling pig was sewn to the rear half of a capon, a rooster, then roasted and presented as if it were a fantastical beast. Or imagine pies from which live birds would fly out when cut open, a delightful surprise for the guests, and probably less delightful for the birds. This wasn't just about food, it was about spectacle, about creating a sense of wonder and demonstrating the almost magical capabilities of the royal household. You might think your local diner making a swan out of a napkin is fancy, but medieval chefs were playing a whole different game. So, as you contemplate your invitation, realise that you're not just going for a meal, you're stepping onto a stage, you're a pawn, albeit a well-dressed and hopefully well-fed pawn, in a much larger game of power, prestige, and political manoeuvring. The king isn't just throwing a party, he's reinforcing his kingdom, one roasted boar at a time. The sheer effort, the planning, the coordination to bring all these elements together, the food, the guests, the entertainment, it's a monumental undertaking. No wonder the royal steward always looks so stressed. He's not just worried about whether the wine is chilled, he's managing a key instrument of statecraft. And you, dear guest, are about to become a vital, if temporary, part of that instrument. Better make sure your shoes are polished. Now that you understand the why behind the impending royal blowout, your mind naturally drifts to the what. Specifically, what marvels will grace the groaning trestle tables? And a significant portion of that what, the star attraction for many a medieval appetite, will undoubtedly be meat. Glorious, roasted, dripping with fat meat. And not just any meat, mind you. While your average peasant might get excited about a bit of bacon or a superannuated chicken, a king's feast demands something more noble. We're talking venison, boar, pheasant, swan, peacock. Creatures of the chase, symbols of aristocratic prowess and the wild, untamed but ultimately king-controlled landscape. To procure these prize centerpieces, you'd need to venture into the king's own private larder, the royal hunting grounds. So, let's imagine you've donned some suitably rugged, yet still impressively tailored hunting attire. Think less camouflage and more Lincoln green, perhaps with a jaunty feather in your cap. You're riding out from the castle at dawn, the air crisp and carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. The king himself, a keen sportsman, might even be leading the party, surrounded by his most trusted nobles and a pack of highly trained hounds, their excited yelps echoing through the misty morning. Royal forests weren't just patches of trees. They were vast, legally defined areas, often encompassing woodlands, open heath, farmland, and even villages, all subject to special forest law. This law was notoriously harsh, designed primarily to protect the venison, game animals, especially deer, and the vert, the greenery that sustained them, for the king's exclusive pleasure. One well-known historical fact is that under Norman forest law in England, killing a deer in a royal forest could result in blinding or even death for an unauthorised peasant. It wasn't just theft, it was an affront to the king's prerogative. As you ride deeper into the woods, the sounds of the everyday world fade, replaced by the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs under hoof, and the occasional call of a bird. The royal huntsmen, experts in tracking and woodland lore, would be fanning out looking for fresh signs. A hoofprint in the mud, a recently nibbled sapling, the telltale droppings of a stag. These men were professionals, their skills honed over years, often passed down through generations. They knew the forest like the back of their hand, every game trail, every watering hole, every thicket where a wary boar might be hiding. They could read the landscape like a book, a skill utterly alien to most city dwellers, then and now. You might just see a bunch of trees. They see a complex ecosystem teeming with potential quarry. The hunt itself could take various forms. There was the par-force hunt, a thrilling, often dangerous chase where horsemen and hounds pursued a stag or boar for miles, relying on speed, stamina, and skill. This was the aristocratic ideal, a miniature cavalry charge through the wilderness, full of adrenaline and the thunder of hooves. Then there was the more controlled bow and stable hunt, where beaters would drive game towards concealed archers or towards enclosures where they could be more easily dispatched. This was less about the thrill of the chase and more about efficiently stocking the royal kitchens. Sometimes ladies of the court would participate, often shooting from specially constructed stands or using trained hawks to bring down smaller game like pheasant or partridge. Falconry was an art form in itself, a mark of high status, with birds of prey being incredibly valuable and meticulously trained. A king might even have a royal falconer, a prestigious court position. Let's say today, the king fancies a wild boar. These were formidable creatures, notoriously strong, fast, and armed with sharp tusks, capable of disemboweling a hound or even a horse. Hunting boar was not for the faint of heart. The hounds, specially bred for courage and tenacity, would corner the beast, their baying echoing through the forest. Then, a skilled huntsman, or perhaps the king himself if he was feeling particularly brave, or wanted to appear so, would move in for the kill, typically with a sturdy boar spear designed with a crossguard to prevent the enraged animal from charging up the shaft after being impaled. It's a brutal, visceral business, a world away from shrink-wrapped pork chops in a supermarket. You can almost smell the metallic tang of blood mixed with the earthy scent of the forest floor. And there's always the risk of injury. More than one medieval noble met an untimely end on a hunt, gored by a boar or thrown from a horse. It was the medieval equivalent of extreme sports, but with much pointier animals. Once the quarry, be it a magnificent stag with a full rack of antlers, a tusked boar, or a string of plump pheasants, is brought down, the work isn't over. There's a whole ritual to the breaking or gralloching of the deer, the careful disemboweling and preparation of the carcass. Certain parts, like the liver or heart, might even be cooked and eaten on the spot by the hunting party, a rustic reward for their efforts. The rest would be carefully transported back to the castle, a triumphant procession. The sight of the successful hunting party returning, laden with game, was a powerful visual. It reinforced the king's mastery over his domain and promised a well-stocked table for the upcoming feast. A quirky and somewhat eyebrow-raising tidbit from the world of medieval hunting involves the use of buck stalls, or deer haze. These were essentially large nets or enclosures, sometimes stretching for considerable distances, into which deer would be driven by beaters. While effective, some purists considered this method less sporting than the par-forced chase. It was a bit like shooting fish in a barrel, if the barrel was several acres of forest and the fish had antlers. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of these royal hunts was truly about sport and leisure for the king and his nobles, or if it was more fundamentally about resource management and the assertion of royal authority over vast tracts of land that might otherwise be exploited by commoners. The elaborate rules, the severe penalties, and the sheer scale of royal forests suggest a strong element of control. So, as you watch the expertly dispatched stag being carefully loaded onto a pack horse, its lifeless eyes staring blankly at the canopy above, you realise that this is just the first step in a long and complex chain that leads to the feasting table. The royal hunting grounds are not just a playground for the elite, they're a crucial source of the high-status food that defines a royal banquet. The effort, the danger, the sheer skill involved in transforming a wild creature of the forest into a centrepiece for the king's table is immense. And this is just one category of food. The feast will demand so much more. But for now, the scent of pine and the distant echo of a hunting horn linger in your mind, a prelude to the culinary spectacle to come. The successful hunt has secured the venison and boar, those prized symbols of aristocratic feasting, but a medieval king cannot live on roasted stag alone, though some probably tried. The sheer scale of a royal feast catering to potentially hundreds, if not thousands, of guests over several days demands a logistical operation that would make a modern military quartermaster nod in grudging respect. Beyond the thrill of the chase in the royal forests, there's a vast, complex, and often overlooked network of farms, manors, rivers, and supply lines, all dedicated to stocking the royal larder. You might imagine the king simply snapping his fingers and food appearing, but the reality is a constant, intricate dance of procurement, preservation, and transportation. Picture the royal domain, the lands directly controlled by the crown. These aren't just picturesque country estates, they're working agricultural units, crucial cogs in the provisioning machine. Tenant farmers on these lands owe a portion of their produce to the king as part of their feudal obligations. This could be anything from sacks of wheat and barley, essential for bread and ale, staples we'll get to later, to cheeses, butter, eggs, and live animals like cattle, sheep, and pigs. These weren't the sleek, scientifically bred animals you see today. Medieval livestock was generally smaller, hardier, and probably a lot more flavourful, having foraged more naturally. You'd see drovers, weather-beaten men skilled in managing livestock, guiding herds of cattle or flocks of sheep along dusty roads towards the royal palace or the castle currently in residence. These journeys could take days, even weeks, and the animals would lose weight en route, a constant headache for the royal purveyors. Then there are the specialised suppliers. Certain regions might be known for particular delicacies. Perhaps there's a monastery famed for its eel pies, or a coastal town that can provide barrels of salted herring or cod, especially important for fast days. The king's purveyors, officials tasked with obtaining supplies, would be constantly on the move, negotiating prices, requisitioning goods, sometimes with a royal prerogative that felt a lot like polite theft to the unlucky supplier, and arranging for their transport. One mainstream historical fact is the existence of the right of purveyance, or prize, which allowed the royal household to compulsorily purchase goods and services for the king's needs, often at fixed, below-market, prices, and sometimes with delayed payment. This was a deeply unpopular but essential mechanism for provisioning the enormous and itinerant royal court. Imagine a government official showing up at your artisan bakery and saying, "We'll take all your sourdough and we'll pay you, eventually, maybe." Rivers and waterways were vital arteries for this supply chain, transporting bulky goods like barrels of wine, sacks of grain, or even live fish in specially designed wellboats was far more efficient by water than overland on medieval roads, which were often little more than muddy tracks. Barges laden with provisions would make their slow way to the castle. their progress eagerly awaited by the kitchen staff. Coastal trade also played a part, bringing in not just fish, but also imported goods like wine from Gascony, or fruits from warmer climes, if the season and the king's coffers allowed. And let's not forget the gardens and orchards within the castle grounds or nearby manors. These would provide fresh vegetables, herbs and fruits in season. While vegetables didn't always take centre stage in the meat-heavy aristocratic diet, they were certainly present, especially in pottages, thick soups or stews, and salads, which in medieval times often included cooked ingredients. You'd find onions, leeks, garlic, cabbages, peas, beans and root vegetables like parsnips and carrots, which were often purple or yellow, not the bright orange we know today, a variety bred later by the Dutch. Herbs like parsley, sage, rosemary and thyme were essential for flavouring, and also for their perceived medicinal properties. Fruit orchards would yield apples, pears, plums and cherries, eaten fresh, cooked into pies and tarts, or preserved by drying or making them into cider or perry, pear cider. A quirky tidbit for you. Some large medieval estates and monasteries maintained elaborate dovecotes, often impressive circular stone towers housing hundreds of pigeons or doves. Squabs, young pigeons, were considered a delicacy and provided a year-round source of fresh meat, especially useful in winter when other fresh meat was scarce. A well-stocked dovecote was a sign of wealth and good management. It was basically a self-replenishing pantry with wings. You could almost hear the cooing as a constant, gentle reminder that tiny, delicious birds were always on the menu. Preservation was key. Without refrigeration, keeping a massive stockpile of food from spoiling was a constant battle. Salting, smoking, drying and pickling were essential techniques. Meat and fish would be heavily salted or smoked to last through the winter months or long journeys. Fruits might be dried or preserved in honey. Grains needed to be kept dry to prevent mould and vermin. The royal cellars and storehouses would be cool or dark places, carefully managed to maximise the lifespan of their precious contents. The smell in these places would be intense, a complex medley of salt, smoke, spices, fermenting fruit and damper. Not exactly a Yankee Candle scent, but very much the aroma of medieval sustenance. Historians still argue whether the medieval system of provisioning, particularly the reliance on purveyance and feudal dues, was inherently inefficient and exploitative, leading to resentment and hindering broader economic development, or if it was a pragmatic, if imperfect, adaptation to the logistical challenges of the era, ensuring the survival and functioning of the central government and royal household. It probably fostered a certain amount of grumbling among the populace, like a medieval version of complaining about taxes, but with the added frisson that the tax collector might also requisition your prize-winning pig for the king's Sunday roast. So, as the wagons creak under the weight of grain sacks, as drovers guide their weary herds, and as barges laden with barrels of ale navigate the slow-moving rivers, you begin to appreciate the sheer scale of the operation. The forest provides the glamour, but the fields, the farms, the rivers and the roads provide the bulk. Every apple, every loaf of bread, every side of bacon represents a link in this vast chain of production and supply, all converging on the royal kitchens. It's a testament to organisation and yes, a fair bit of royal muscle flexing. The king's feast doesn't just magically appear. It's cultivated, herded, fished, transported and preserved by an army of largely unseen workers, all contributing to that moment when the first magnificent dish is carried into the great hall. The royal larder is now theoretically groaning under the weight of the game from the forests, livestock from the demesne farms, and all manner of provisions brought in by river and road. But simply having a lot of meat and bread, however plentiful, isn't quite enough to elevate a meal to the truly royal standard that so effectively broadcasts power and prestige. For that, you need something more exotic, something that speaks of distant lands, perilous journeys, and eye-watering expense. You need spices. In the medieval world, spices weren't just flavour enhancers. They were the ultimate status symbol, worth more than their weight in gold, and a key ingredient in transforming a mere meal into a statement of regal magnificence. Imagine for a moment you're a royal cook, tasked with preparing a dish for the king's upcoming feast. You have your venison, your capons, your bread flour, but to make it truly sing, to make it worthy of the high table, you reach for your spice box. This isn't your supermarket rack of neatly labelled jars. This is likely a locked chest, perhaps made of carved oak or even inlaid with precious materials, containing small pouches or jars of incredibly potent and valuable powders and seeds. The aroma when you open it is intoxicating, a complex cloud of sweet, pungent and earthy scents that immediately transports you to faraway, almost mythical lands. You'd find ginger from China, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, cloves from the Moluccas, the Spice Islands of Indonesia, nutmeg and mace from the Banda Islands, cardamom from India, and, most prized of all, pepper from India and saffron from, well, saffron could be grown in Europe, but the best was still highly valued and often imported. The journey these spices took to reach your medieval European kitchen was epic, a testament to ancient trade routes and the human appetite for flavour and profit. Think of the Silk Road, or the maritime routes across the Indian Ocean, controlled for centuries by Arab and then Venetian merchants. Each step of the journey added to the cost: tariffs, transport, the risk of shipwreck or banditry. By the time a peppercorn or a stick of cinnamon reached London, Paris, or a German castle, its price had multiplied exponentially. This is why only the very wealthy, primarily royalty and high nobility, could afford to use them with any regularity or in significant quantities. A king lacing his wine with ginger and cloves wasn't just making it taste good. He was drinking his wealth, making an edible display of his economic power. One of the most straightforward historical facts about medieval spices is their astronomical cost. For example, in the 14th century, a pound of nutmeg could cost as much as 7 fattened oxen, and a pound of ginger the same as a sheep. You wouldn't be casually sprinkling cinnamon on your morning porridge unless your porridge bowl was made of solid gold. So, how were these precious commodities used? Lavishly. Medieval cuisine, especially at the aristocratic level, was often heavily spiced. This wasn't always about masking the taste of slightly off meat, as is sometimes popularly believed, though it probably didn't hurt if the meat was a bit past its prime. It was about creating complex, vibrant flavours, often combining sweet and savoury in ways that might seem unusual to modern Western palates. Pepper, cloves and ginger might find their way into a meat pie, while cinnamon and sugar, another expensive import, could be used to glaze roasted chicken. Saffron, prized for its beautiful golden colour as much as its delicate flavour, was used to tint rice dishes, sauces and even breads, giving them a regal, sunny hue. A dish glowing with saffron was a dish fit for a king, visually proclaiming its expense. You'd see dishes like blancmange, not the wobbly modern dessert, but a savoury dish of shredded chicken or fish, rice, almond milk, sugar and spices like ginger or cinnamon, or mortrus, a type of pâté made from minced meat or fish, breadcrumbs, stock and heavily spiced. Sauces were a cornerstone of medieval elite cooking, often thick, dark and complex, relying on spices for their character. A common sauce might be cameline sauce, made with breadcrumbs, vinegar, cinnamon, ginger, cloves and other spices. The names themselves, powder douce, sweet powder, or powder forte, strong powder, refer to pre-mixed spice blends that cooks would keep on hand, the medieval equivalent of garam masala or 5-spice powder. Using these spices wasn't just about taste, it was also about demonstrating sophistication, a knowledge of exotic ingredients and fashionable culinary trends. It was like owning the latest tech gadget, but for your tongue. A quirky and slightly fragrant tidbit is the medieval pomander. This was a ball made of perfumes such as ambergris, a waxy substance from sperm whales, yes really, musk from musk deer, civet from the civet cat, also yes really, and various spices like cloves, nutmeg and cinnamon. These were often encased in ornate metal containers, sometimes shaped like an orange, hence pomme d'ambre, apple of amber, and worn on a chain or carried to ward off bad smells and, it was believed, disease. Imagine attending a feast, and everyone is subtly wafting their personal air freshener made of whale secretions and ground-up spices. It certainly adds a new layer to the sensory experience of a medieval banquet. You wouldn't just smell the food, you'd smell the guests trying to smell better than each other. The control of the spice trade was a massive geopolitical issue. Venice, for example, built much of its incredible wealth and power on its dominance of the spice routes in the later Middle Ages. The desire to find alternative, cheaper routes to the spice-producing regions of the East was a major driving force behind the Age of Exploration. When Vasco da Gama finally reached India by sea in 1498, effectively bypassing the old overland routes and the Venetian monopoly. It was a world-changing event, largely driven by the European craving for these fragrant little seeds and barks. It's not an exaggeration to say that kingdoms were built and empires launched on the back of a peppercorn. Historians still argue whether the heavy use of spices in medieval elite cuisine was primarily about conspicuous consumption, a way to show off wealth, or if it genuinely reflected a different palate, a preference for much stronger and more complex flavour profiles than we typically enjoy today. It's likely a combination of both. The desire to impress was certainly there, but so too was a genuine appreciation for the way these exotic ingredients could transform ordinary foodstuffs into something extraordinary, something that spoke of a wider, more exciting world. So, as you imagine the king's feast taking shape, remember that it's not just the quantity of food that matters, but also its quality and, crucially, its seasoning. Those subtle hints of ginger, the warm embrace of cinnamon, the golden glow of saffron, these are not mere culinary afterthoughts. They are edible declarations of power, wealth, and global reach. They are the king's ransom, sprinkled liberally over his dinner, a fragrant reminder to all present of just who is in charge and how far his influence extends. The simple act of tasting a well-spiced dish at the royal table is a taste of that power, a fleeting connection to the vast interconnected world from which these treasures came. With the game secured, the farms emptied, metaphorically speaking of course, and a king's ransom in spices carefully unlocked from its strongbox, our attention now naturally gravitates towards the heart of the operation, the engine room of the entire feasting enterprise, the royal kitchen. If you're picturing a quaint cottage-style kitchen with a cheerfully whistling cook, think again. A medieval royal kitchen, especially one gearing up for a major feast, was less cosy domesticity and more controlled inferno meets military campaign. It was a vast, bustling, hot, smoky and surprisingly organised world, a realm of intense activity and specialised labour, all dedicated to transforming raw ingredients into the magnificent dishes destined for the king's table. As you approach the kitchen complex, and it often was, a complex, sometimes a separate building or a series of interconnected rooms to reduce the risk of fire spreading to the main castle and to keep the heat and smell somewhat contained, the first thing that hits you is the sheer sensory overload. The roar of fires, the clatter of pots and pans, more like cauldrons and massive skillets, the rhythmic thud of cleavers on wooden blocks, the shouting of orders, and an overwhelming miasma of smoke, steam, roasting meat, boiling vegetables, baking bread, and yes, probably a fair bit of medieval body odour. It's a hot, humid and incredibly noisy environment. You'd probably start sweating just by standing in the doorway. It makes a modern restaurant kitchen on a Saturday night look like a tranquil meditation retreat. The centrepiece of many a large medieval kitchen was the great hearth, or multiple hearths, often enormous structures, sometimes large enough for a whole ox to be roasted on a spit. These weren't neat, contained fireplaces. They were blazing infernos, consuming vast quantities of firewood, which had to be constantly supplied by an army of woodcutters and carriers. The heat generated would have been immense, making the area immediately around the fires almost unbearable for the uninitiated. Spits, some of them massive, requiring several strong boys, known as spitjacks or turnspits, to turn them constantly and evenly, would be laden with joints of meat, whole birds, or even entire animals, their fat dripping and sizzling into pans below, the sound a constant hungry hiss. Sometimes, actual dogs, called turnspit dogs, a now extinct breed, were used in a kind of canine treadmill to power the spits. You can imagine these poor pups, desperately trying to keep up, probably dreaming of a quiet corner and a leftover bone. Beyond the main roasting areas, you'd find other specialised zones. There would be a boiling section, with huge cauldrons suspended over fires, bubbling away with stews, pottages, or large cuts of meat being tenderised. There'd be a bakehouse, with its own ovens for bread, pies, and pastries. The ovens themselves were often large, domed brick structures, heated by burning wood directly inside, then raking out the embers before the food was placed in to bake in the residual heat. Getting the temperature right was an art form, relying entirely on the baker's experience and intuition. No digital thermostats here. You judged the heat by how quickly you could count before your hand felt like it was about to combust. Then there's the larder, the cooler area for storing perishable goods, and the buttery, not just for butter, but also for ale and wine storage and dispensing. There would be sculleries for washing up, an endless thankless task involving greasy pots, wooden platters, and a lot of sand or coarse rushes for scouring. Imagine the sheer volume of dishes from a feast for hundreds. The scullery workers were the unsung, perpetually damp heroes of the medieval kitchen. A mainstream historical fact is that many larger castles and palaces had sophisticated water management systems, including wells, cisterns, and even lead pipes to bring water into the kitchens and sculleries, though running water, as we know it, was still a distant dream. Despite the apparent chaos, there was a definite organisation, a hierarchy of labour that we'll explore more soon. Different tasks were assigned to different people, from the master cook, who was a highly skilled and often well-compensated professional, down to the lower scullion boy. Precision and timing were crucial. With multiple courses, each comprising many different dishes, all needing to be ready at roughly the same time and served hot, or appropriately chilled, the logistical coordination was immense. It was like conducting a very loud, very hot orchestra. One quirky and slightly alarming aspect of medieval kitchens was the ever-present risk of fire. With open flames everywhere, flammable materials like straw on the floor for soaking up spills and general medieval messiness, and wooden structures, a stray spark could easily lead to disaster. Kitchen fires were a common hazard in medieval castles and manor houses. That's one reason why kitchens were often built as detached structures, as mentioned. If the kitchen went up in flames, hopefully the rest of the royal residence would be spared. It's a rather pragmatic approach to fire safety. If the inferno starts, at least it'll be that inferno over there. Historians still argue whether the primary concern in the design and operation of medieval royal kitchens was efficiency in food production, or if factors like symbolic display, even within the kitchen itself for important visitors, and the management of a large, potentially unruly workforce also played significant roles. The sheer scale of some kitchens, like the one at Hampton Court Palace, though later than our core medieval period, it reflects similar principles, suggests a system designed for massive output, but also for the clear demarcation of roles and the maintenance of order amidst the potential bedlam. You peek into this swirling vortex of heat, noise, and frantic activity. Young boys scurry about, fetching water, carrying firewood, or turning those never-ending spits. Cooks, red-faced and sweating, expertly wield knives, ladles, and stirring spoons, their movements economical and precise despite the pressure. The air is thick enough to chew, a potent brew of 1,000 culinary processes happening at once. It's a far cry from the serene image of a king calmly awaiting his dinner. This is where the magic and a whole lot of hard graft happens. It's a place of intense creation, where raw nature is transformed by fire and skill into culture, into a statement of royal power. And it's probably the last place you'd want to be if you were wearing anything flammable or had a sensitive nose. But without this roaring, chaotic heart, there would be no feast. Stepping further into the fiery, fragrant chaos of the royal kitchen, or perhaps just observing from a slightly less scorching vantage point, you begin to see beyond the initial impression of pandemonium. There's a structure here, a well-defined hierarchy, a veritable army of specialists, each playing their crucial role in the grand culinary offensive. This isn't just a random assortment of people slinging hash. This is the Royal Kitchen Brigade, a team as organised in its own way as any knightly order or guild of craftsmen. Leading this gastronomic battalion is the Master Cook. The Master Cook, or Magister Cookorum, was no mere servant. He, and it was almost invariably a he in such high-status kitchens, was a highly respected and often very well-paid professional. He might have his own staff, substantial living quarters, and even land. He was an artist, an administrator, and a logistician all rolled into one. He planned the menus, often in consultation with the royal steward, or even the king himself, especially for important feasts. He oversaw the purchasing of ingredients, managed the kitchen budget, or at least tried to keep it from completely bankrupting the kingdom, and directed the entire kitchen staff. His word was law amidst the clatter and steam. He would have had years, probably decades of experience, working his way up through various kitchen roles, learning the subtle arts of seasoning, roasting, baking, and sauce-making. He needed a discerning palate, an encyclopedic knowledge of recipes, many of which were passed down orally or in closely guarded personal notebooks, and the ability to command a large and diverse team under immense pressure. Think Gordon, Ramsay, but with more ermine trim on his tunic and a higher chance of being beheaded if the soup was cold. Beneath the master cook, the kitchen brigade fanned out into a fascinating array of specialised roles. You'd have the parceller, or pastry cook, responsible for all things baked in a crust. Pies, tarts, pasties, and those elaborate edible sculptures called subtleties that we'll get to later. This was a highly skilled job, requiring a delicate touch for pastry and a creative flair for design. Then there was the saucier, a sauce maker, a master of balancing flavours, creating the rich, complex sauces that were so integral to medieval elite cuisine. Remember that cameline sauce? That was his domain. He'd be working with wine, vinegar, verjuice, the sour juice of unripe grapes, spices, and a host of other ingredients to produce a repertoire of sauces to accompany different meats and fish. The larderer, or keeper of the larder, was in charge of the raw meat and fish, overseeing its storage, butchering and initial preparation. He needed to know how to properly joint a deer, prepare a boar's head for display, or scale and gut hundreds of fish. This was physically demanding and often messy work. His domain would be a cooler part of the kitchen complex filled with hanging carcasses and barrels of salted meat. You'd also find specialists like the poultrier, dealing specifically with chickens, ducks, geese, swans, peacocks and other feathered delicacies, and the fruiterer, responsible for fruits, nuts and sometimes vegetables, ensuring they were fresh, properly stored and prepared for use. One interesting and often overlooked group were the scullions. These were the lowest ranking members of the kitchen staff, often young boys or men, responsible for the endless back-breaking work of cleaning pots, pans and dishes, scrubbing floors, fetching water, carrying firewood, and generally doing all the dirty jobs that no one else wanted. It was a gruelling existence, but for some, it was the first rung on the ladder to a more skilled kitchen position. A diligent scullion might eventually become a turnspit, then perhaps an assistant to one of the specialised cooks, slowly learning the craft. The scullery was probably the wettest, groomiest, and least glamorous part of the entire kitchen, but utterly essential. You can imagine them, perpetually damp and smelling faintly of stale grease and wood smoke. And let's not forget those turnspits, or spitjacks, the poor souls, or dogs as we mentioned, tasked with the monotonous but crucial job of turning the roasting spits. For hours on end they would sit or stand by the searing heat of the fire, slowly rotating the heavy spits to ensure the meat cooked evenly. It was hot, smoky and mind-numbingly dull work. A quirky tidbit. There were even attempts to automate this process with mechanical devices using weights and pulleys, early examples of kitchen technology, though human or canine power remained the norm for a long time. Some of these mechanical spits were quite ingenious, if prone to breaking down at the worst possible moment, probably when the king's prize boar was halfway to perfection. Beyond the kitchen itself, you had related roles. The butler, from the old French bouteiller, or bottle-bearer, was in charge of the buttery, responsible for the ale, wine, and other beverages. He oversaw the cellars, managed the stock, and supervised the serving of drinks. The panter, or keeper of the pantry, was responsible for bread, salt, and table linen. He would ensure a ready supply of bread, from the finest white manchet for the high table to the coarser loaves for the lower ranks, and would also oversee the elaborate rituals associated with salt, a precious commodity. A mainstream historical fact. The sheer number of people involved in a major royal household's food service could be staggering. The household of King Richard II of England in the late 14th century, for example, is recorded as having around 300 people working in the kitchens and related departments. This wasn't just a couple of cooks, it was an institution. Historians still argue whether the elaborate division of labour in medieval royal kitchens was primarily driven by a desire for culinary excellence and efficiency, or if it also reflected broader societal trends towards specialisation and the reinforcement of hierarchical structures within the household. Was having a separate waferer, maker of delicate wafer-thin biscuits, a practical necessity, or a way to add another layer of luxurious specialisation to the king's service? It's likely a bit of both. The complexity of the food demanded specialists, and the presence of so many specialists underscored the king's ability to command such a vast and skilled workforce. So, as you observe this well-oiled and probably well-greased machine in action, you see that each person, from the master cook tasting a sauce with a discerning frown, to the saucier carefully grinding spices, to the scullion boy hauling another bucket of water, has a specific and vital part to play. It's a complex dance of skill, labour and coordination, all building towards the moment the dishes are triumphantly carried forth. The king may be the one who gets the glory for the magnificent feast, but it's this largely unseen army in the kitchen, this dedicated brigade of culinary artisans and labourers, who truly make it happen. Their sweat, their skill and their ability to function under pressure are the secret ingredients in every royal banquet. The Royal Kitchen Brigade, a well-oiled machine of specialised labour, is toiling away amidst the heat and savoury steam. While the roasts are turning and the sauces are simmering, another, perhaps less glamorous but equally vital, operation is in full swing: the production of bread. In the medieval world, bread wasn't just a side dish. It was the staff of life, a fundamental component of nearly every meal, from the humblest peasant's repast to the most extravagant royal feast. Its significance went far beyond mere sustenance. It was laden with social, economic, and even symbolic meaning. You might think, it's just bread. But in the medieval context, that would be like saying, it's just air. The royal household would have its own bakehouse, or pastorium, often a separate building for the same fire safety reasons as the main kitchen. Here, under the direction of the panter, the keeper of the pantry, who, as we know, also had bread under his purview, or a master baker, a team of bakers would be engaged in a constant cycle of mixing, kneading, proving and baking. The quantities required for a royal feast, let alone the daily needs of a large court, were immense. We're talking about hundreds, perhaps thousands of loaves. The bakehouse would be warm, dusty with flour, and filled with the comforting, earthy aroma of baking bread. A welcome contrast to the more intense, meaty smells of the main kitchen. Not all bread was created equal, and this is where the social hierarchy of the feasting table became starkly apparent, even in something as basic as a loaf. The finest bread destined for the king, his family, and the most honoured guests at the high table was called manchi, or pain de main, Lord's bread. This was made from the finest, whitest wheat flour, sieved multiple times to remove all the bran and germ. It was light, airy, by medieval standards at least, and a clear symbol of status. Producing such white flour was labour-intensive and wasteful, as much of the grain was discarded, making it incredibly expensive. If you were served manchet, you knew you were in the presence of the A-list. It was the medieval equivalent of getting the good champagne, not the cheap Prosecco. Further down the social scale, you'd find various types of wheaten bread that were less refined. Cheat bread, for example, was made from whole wheat flour, or flour that had been sieved less thoroughly, resulting in a darker, denser loaf. This would be served to lesser nobles, knights, and important household officials. Then there was revel or tourt bread, made from coarser flours, sometimes mixed with rye or barley. This was the everyday bread for the lower echelons of the household, the servants, the soldiers, and the general throng who might be fed below the salt or in a separate hall. And for the truly indigent, or in times of famine, bread might be made from anything that could be ground into flour, including beans, peas, or even acorns, though this was a sign of desperation, not feasting. The type of bread you were served was a very clear and public indicator of your social standing. It's a bit like airline classes, but with more gluten. Beyond its role as food, bread also served a crucial function as an edible utensil and plate. We're talking about trenchers. Before the widespread adoption of individual plates, which didn't become common until much later, food, especially meat and items with sauces, was often served on thick, flattish slabs of stale bread, usually the coarser, darker varieties. These were the trenchers, from the old French trancher, to cut. You would place your portion of meat on your trencher, and it would conveniently soak up all the delicious juices and sauces. At the end of the course, or the meal, what happened to these gravy-soaked trenchers varied. Very poor or very hungry guests might eat their trenchers. More commonly, especially at aristocratic tables, the trenchers were collected and given as alms to the poor, who would gather at the castle gates, or perhaps fed to the dogs. One mainstream historical fact is that the use of bread trenchers was standard practice in wealthy households across Europe for centuries. It's an ingenious, if slightly soggy, solution to the problem of disposable tableware. The baking process itself was a craft. Bakers needed to understand the qualities of different flours, the behaviour of yeast, which was often cultivated from beer brewing known as barm, and the intense heat of the wood-fired ovens. They would mix the dough in large wooden troughs, then knead it vigorously to develop the gluten, a physically demanding task. The dough would be left to rise, then shaped into loaves of various sizes and forms, round, oblong, plated. Sometimes, loaves destined for the high table might even be marked with a special stamp or design. Getting the bake right, achieving a good crust and a well-cooked interior without burning, required skill and constant attention. Remember, these ovens had no temperature gauges. It was all done by experience, by the feel of the heat, the colour of the oven walls. A quirky and rather charming tidbit about medieval bread involves sops. These were pieces of bread, often toasted or fried, that were specifically intended for dipping into wine, ale, or broth. The word soup itself is derived from sop, and supper was originally a light evening meal, often consisting of sops. So next time you dip your toast in your tea or your crusty bread in your soup, you're partaking in a very old culinary tradition. It's the medieval version of dunking your Oreos, just with slightly more feudalism. The symbolism of bread was also profound. In a Christian society, bread was, of course, deeply connected to the Eucharist, the body of Christ. This imbued it with a sacred quality. Sharing bread was a sign of hospitality, fellowship, and community. The breaking of bread was a powerful symbol of peace and unity. The quality and abundance of bread at a king's feast, therefore, spoke not only of his wealth, but also of his role as a beneficent provider, a paterfamilias to his kingdom. Historians still argue about the exact nutritional quality of medieval bread, especially the whiter varieties. While white bread was prized for its purity and status, the removal of the bran and germ also removed much of the fibre and B vitamins. Did the medieval elite, by insisting on the whitest bread, inadvertently trade nutrition for status? It's quite possible that the coarser, darker breads consumed by the common folk were actually more nutritious, if less prestigious. It's a classic case of style over substance, perhaps. So, as the bakers pull batch after batch of fragrant loaves from the roaring ovens, the fine manchet for the king, the sturdy cheat for the knights, and the dark trenchers that will soon bear the weight of roasted meats, remember that this humble staple is anything but simple. It's a product of skill, a marker of status, a vital utensil, and a potent symbol. The feast would be unthinkable without it. The aroma of fresh bread, mingling with the scent of roasting game and exotic spices, is a fundamental part of the sensory tapestry of the royal banquet, a comforting, universal signal that sustenance and society are about to be celebrated. The bread is baked, golden and fragrant, ready to serve as both sustenance and trencher. The spices are measured, their exotic aromas promising a taste of faraway lands. The kitchen brigade is a whirlwind of focused activity. Now it's time to turn our attention to what, for many at the royal feast, is the undisputed main event, the meats. And we're not talking about a polite chicken breast or a modest steak. We're talking about a staggering, almost overwhelming profusion of animal protein, cooked in a myriad of ways, a veritable medieval meat-topia that would make a modern cardiologist weep into his low-fat yogurt. The sheer variety and quantity of meats presented at a significant royal feast were designed to impress, to demonstrate the king's wealth, the bounty of his lands, and his ability to command the finest and most diverse provisions. As you, the honoured guest, take your place in the Great Hall, we'll get to the seating and atmosphere later. Prepare to be awestruck by the procession of dishes. This isn't a single main course, it's a series of removes, or courses, each potentially featuring multiple meat dishes. Forget your 3-course meal. A truly grand feast might have 6, 7, or even more courses, each a spectacle in itself. First and foremost, there's the roasted meat, the star of many a medieval culinary dream. Remember those massive spits we saw in the kitchen, turned by diligent spitjacks or industrious turnspit dogs? Now you see their glorious output. Whole roasted animals or large joints, glistening with fat, perhaps basted with spices and honey, would be paraded into the hall and carved with great ceremony, often by high-ranking nobles or specialised carvers who were masters of their art. You might see a haunch of venison, dark and rich, from the royal hunt. A wild boar, its fearsome head perhaps still attached, a symbolic trophy. Sides of beef, whole roasted sheep or lambs, suckling pigs with crackling skin so crisp it shatters at the touch. And of course, poultry in abundance. capons, castrated roosters prized for their tender, flavourful meat, geese, ducks, and perhaps even game birds like pheasant, partridge, and woodcock, often roasted and served with their plumage reattached for a particularly dramatic presentation. The sight of a roasted peacock, painstakingly redressed in its iridescent feathers and arranged as if still alive, was a classic medieval showstopper. It tasted apparently a bit like tough chicken, but that was hardly the point. It was all about the visual impact. But roasting wasn't the only way to prepare meat. Boiling was also extremely common, especially for tougher cuts, or as a first step before further cooking. Large cauldrons would bubble away with joints of beef, mutton, or pork, often with vegetables and herbs to create a flavourful broth. This boiled meat might then be sliced and served with a pungent mustard sauce, or shredded and incorporated into other dishes. Stews and pottages, thick savoury concoctions of meat, vegetables, grains, and spices were also staples. These were hearty, filling dishes, and a good way to use up less prime cuts of meat and stretch ingredients. Think of a rich, dark venison stew, simmered for hours with root vegetables and red wine if available, thickened with breadcrumbs, and heady with the scent of cloves and pepper. It's the kind of dish that sticks to your ribs, and probably to your tunic if you're not careful. Pies and pasties were another hugely popular way to serve meat. Not your delicate little individual pies, but often massive, robust creations with thick pastry crusts, designed to hold generous fillings of chopped or minced meat, often mixed with dried fruits, spices, and a rich gravy. A great pie might be a centerpiece in itself, its crust elaborately decorated. Venison pasties, pork pies, chicken and mushroom pies, the variety was endless. Sometimes these pies contained not just one type of meat, but several, a medieval meaty medley. And remember those live birds flying out of a pie we mentioned earlier? That was peak medieval pie-making showmanship, though one imagines the cleanup was less than delightful. Who ordered the pie with the surprise pigeons? And does anyone have a net? A mainstream historical fact regarding meat consumption is that medieval people, especially the nobility, consumed far more meat than the average person today when it was available. However, this was often balanced by periods of fasting, especially during Lent when meat was forbidden. This cyclical pattern of feasting and fasting was a defining characteristic of the medieval diet. Then you have the more, shall we say, adventurous meats, at least by modern standards. Small birds like larks, thrushes and sparrows were considered delicacies, often roasted whole and eaten in a single bite. Squirrels and rabbits were common fare. And then there were the showpieces, like a whole roasted swan, often served with its neck arched gracefully and its feathers reapplied, sometimes even gilded with gold leaf. It was less about the taste, swan is reportedly quite oily and tough, and more about the sheer aristocratic audacity of serving such a magnificent creature. One quirky and slightly grisly tidbit is the occasional appearance of helmeted cock, where a roasted capon would be fitted with a miniature paper helmet and lance, as if ready for a tiny joust on your trencher. Medieval chefs clearly had a sense of humour, or perhaps just a lot of time on their hands between stirring pots. The sheer abundance could be overwhelming. Dish after dish would arrive, a seemingly endless parade of protein. You as a guest would not be expected to eat everything, or even a large portion of every dish. You would sample what appealed to you, or what was placed conveniently before you, but the availability of such choice, such excess was the point. It was a statement of overwhelming plenty. Historians still argue about the actual health implications of such a meat-heavy diet for the medieval aristocracy. While it provided ample protein, it was also high in fat and cholesterol, and potentially low in certain vitamins if not balanced with enough fruits, vegetables and grains. Gout, a painful inflammatory condition associated with rich food and drink, was notoriously common among the wealthy in the Middle Ages, often called the disease of kings. It's a rather unpleasant souvenir from too many royal feasts, as the carvers expertly dissect a roasted sirloin. The name itself, sirloin, is apocryphally said to have been given by a delighted English king, though the story is likely just that, a story. And as the aroma of countless cooked beasts fills the great hall, you're immersed in a world where meat is king. It's a display of dominance over the animal kingdom, a showcase of wealth, and a deep satisfaction of a primal human craving. The variety is dazzling, the quantity astounding. This is not just dinner, This is a carnivore's carnival, a testament to the king's power to command the very best and the very most from land, forest and farm. Grab your knife, forks are still mostly a future fancy, remember, and prepare to tuck in. Just, maybe, pace yourself. There are still more courses to come. The magnificent parade of roasted, boiled and stewed meats has left you feeling suitably impressed, and perhaps a little overwhelmed. The sheer variety and quantity are staggering, a testament to the king's bounty and the skill of his kitchen brigade. But the medieval culinary landscape, even at a royal feast, wasn't solely a carnivore's paradise. Religious observances played a hugely significant role in shaping what people ate and when. The church's calendar was peppered with fast days. Days when the consumption of meat from land animals and birds, as well as animal products like eggs and dairy, depending on the strictness of the observance and the region, was forbidden. This didn't mean starvation, especially not for a king. Instead, it led to the development of an equally elaborate and often very luxurious alternative cuisine, the fish feast. The most significant period of fasting was Lent, the 40 days leading up to Easter, but there were also other fast days throughout the year, such as Fridays, in commemoration of the crucifixion, Wednesdays, Saturdays, in some regions, the vigils of important feasts, and Ember Days. In total, a significant portion of the year could be designated as lean or fish days. For the common folk, this often meant a meagre diet of salted herring and whatever vegetables they could find. But for the royal household, oh no, a fast day was just another opportunity to showcase culinary ingenuity and wealth, albeit with a different set of ingredients. If the king was hosting a feast during Lent or on a Friday, you wouldn't see that glorious roasted venison or swan. Instead, you'd be treated to an astonishing array of fish and other aquatic creatures, prepared with just as much care and extravagance as their meaty counterparts. Imagine the scene. The great hall is still abuzz. The tapestries still glow in the torchlight, but the aroma is different. Less roasting fat, more fishy, but in a refined, spiced, and altogether enticing way. The royal purveyors would have been working overtime to secure a dazzling variety of fresh and preserved fish. From the rivers and lakes came pike, carp, perch, tench, bream, trout, salmon, and the highly prized eels. From the sea, a bounty of cod, haddock, plaice, sole, turbot, mackerel and herring. Shellfish too, oysters, mussels, crabs and even lobster, if the location and expense allowed. And let's not forget that some rather surprising creatures were classified as fish for dietary purposes. Beavers, due to their scaly tails and aquatic habitat, were sometimes considered permissible on fast days. Puffins and barnacle geese too, because of their association with water, occasionally found their way onto the fish day menu. Medieval theologians had some interesting ways of categorizing the animal kingdom when it suited culinary needs. It's a bit like declaring a tomato a fruit for botanical reasons, but a vegetable for culinary ones, only with more at stake for your immortal soul and your dinner. Preserved fish was absolutely crucial, especially for inland courts, or during seasons when fresh fish was scarce. Salted cod, stockfish, and salted or smoked herring were staples, but even these humble ingredients could be transformed in the royal kitchen. Stockfish, so hard it was said it could be used as a weapon, would be soaked for days, then boiled, baked, or incorporated into elaborate pies and stews, often heavily disguised with spices and sauces. Smoked salmon, a luxury then as now, might grace the high table. One mainstream historical fact is the immense economic importance of the herring trade in the Middle Ages. Vast fleets fished for herring in the North Sea and the Baltic, and the preserved fish were exported all over Europe, forming a critical part of the food supply, especially during Lent. But a royal fish feast wasn't just about salted herring. Oh no! The master cook and his team would pull out all the stops. You might see enormous pike, poached whole and served with a green sauce made of herbs and sorrel. Elaborate fish pies, with intricate pastry work, filled with salmon, eels, or a mixture of white fish, seasoned with saffron, ginger and mace. Blancmange, that versatile dish, could be made with flaked white fish instead of chicken, still creamy with almond milk and sweetened with sugar. There were fish stews, fish jellies, aspics, often beautifully coloured and moulded, and even imitation meat dishes made from fish, cleverly seasoned and shaped to resemble sausages or meatballs. The goal was to make the fast-day feast as impressive and satisfying as any meat-filled banquet. It was a culinary challenge, and one that medieval cooks rose to with gusto. A quirky tidbit about medieval fish consumption involves the royal fish: sturgeon, whale, and porpoise. In England, by a statute from the reign of Edward II, these creatures, if caught near the coast, were declared the property of the crown. So, if a magnificent sturgeon washed ashore, or was caught by a lucky fisherman, it was destined for the king's table, or he at least had first dibs. Sturgeon roe, or caviar, was already recognised as a delicacy, though perhaps not with the same cult status it has today. Imagine the excitement if a truly massive sturgeon arrived at the kitchen, a royal perquisite ready to be transformed into a fast-day showpiece. Historians still argue about the true impact of these religious dietary restrictions on the overall health and nutrition of the medieval population. Did the regular consumption of fish, with its beneficial oils, provide a healthier balance to the often meat-heavy diet of the wealthy? Or did the reliance on heavily salted and preserved fish, especially for the less well-off, lead to other health problems? For the aristocracy at least, the fish days offered a different, but no less luxurious culinary experience, ensuring that even their piety was well seasoned and impressively presented. So, as you sit at this Lenten banquet, or perhaps a grand Friday feast, you marvel at the ingenuity. The absence of meat is not a deprivation, but an invitation to explore a whole different realm of culinary artistry. The tables are still laden, the spices still fragrant, the wine still flows. Instead of a peacock, perhaps a giant carp, baked in a salt crust and unveiled with ceremony. Instead of venison stew, a rich pottage of eels and oysters. It's a reminder that the rhythms of medieval life and the contents of the royal plate were deeply intertwined with the dictates of faith. Even in abstinence, there was an opportunity for abundance, for demonstrating that the king's power and resources could triumph even over the limitations of a fast. And who knows, you might even develop a taste for that beaver tail. Stranger things have happened at a medieval feast. The courses continue to arrive, whether they be laden with the rich meats of a regular feast day, or the surprisingly opulent offerings of a fish day. The sheer quantity and variety are already enough to boggle the mind. But medieval feasting wasn't just about filling bellies. It was about delighting the eyes, surprising the senses, and showcasing the almost magical transformative power of the royal kitchen. This is where subtleties and other food illusions come into play, elevating the meal from mere sustenance to a form of edible theatre. These were the showstoppers, the conversation pieces, the medieval equivalent of molecular gastronomy combined with a Las Vegas stage show, all designed to elicit gasps of wonder and admiration from the assembled guests. So, what exactly is a subtlety? In the context of a medieval banquet, a subtlety, or entremet in French, meaning between servings, was an elaborate, often highly sculptural dish served between the main courses of a feast. Originally, they might have been simpler palate cleansers or light dishes, but by the high and late Middle Ages they had evolved into incredible works of art, sometimes edible, sometimes purely decorative, designed to entertain, impress, and often convey symbolic messages. Think of them as the half-time show of the medieval dinner, but with more marzipan and less pop music. Imagine, as one course is cleared away, a hush falls over the great hall. Then, carried in with great ceremony by liveried servants, comes the subtlety. It might be a miniature castle, complete with towers and battlements, all crafted from gilded gingerbread or marzipan. Or perhaps a hunting scene, with stags and hounds sculpted from sugar paste, set amidst a forest of spun sugar trees. Mythological creatures were popular subjects. Griffins, dragons, unicorns, all rendered in edible, or at least non-toxic, materials. Sometimes these subtleties depicted historical events, biblical scenes, or allegorical representations of virtues and vices. They were, in effect, edible political cartoons, moral lessons, or just pure fantasy, depending on the occasion and the message the king wished to send. The more elaborate the subtlety, the more it spoke of the host's wealth and the skill of his cooks and confectioners. It was pure, unadulterated food art. The materials used to create these masterpieces were varied. Sugar paste, a mixture of sugar, gum tragacanth and water, similar to modern fondant, was a favourite, as it could be moulded, sculpted and coloured. Marzipan, made from almonds and sugar, was another versatile medium. Jellies and aspics, coloured brightly with natural food dyes, derived from plants like spinach, for green, sandalwood or alkanet root, for red, or saffron, for gold-yellow, could be set in elaborate moulds. Even wax was sometimes used for purely decorative elements, though one hoped guests wouldn't accidentally try to eat those bits. And gilding, applying fine gold leaf to the surface of these creations, was a common way to add a touch of ultimate luxury. If it sparkled, it was probably important. Beyond the grand sculptural subtleties, there was also a playful tradition of food illusions, dishes designed to look like something they were not. This was where the medieval cook could really show off his wit and skill, delighting and tricking the diners. Remember the cockatrice we touched upon earlier? The front half of a piglet sewn to the back half of a capon and roasted? That's a prime example. It would arrive at the table looking like some bizarre mythical beast, only to be revealed as a clever culinary construction. Or how about false eggs, where almond paste might be shaped and coloured to look like a hard-boiled egg? Or even meat dishes made entirely from fish or vegetables, cleverly disguised to fool the eye and sometimes the palate on fast days. You might be served what looks like a joint of venison, only to discover it's artfully constructed from spiced and compacted pike. Surprise! One mainstream historical fact is that sugar, while known in Europe for centuries, became more widely available, though still incredibly expensive, from the 11th century onwards, largely due to increased contact with the Arab world during the Crusades and the expansion of sugarcane cultivation in places like Cyprus and Sicily. This increased availability of sugar was a key factor in the development of these elaborate subtleties and other sweet confections. Before sugar, honey was the primary sweetener, and while good for many things, it didn't offer the same sculptural possibilities as sugar paste. A particularly quirky and rather delightful example of a food illusion involved making apples out of meat. For instance, finely minced pork or chicken could be seasoned, mixed with breadcrumbs and egg, then shaped into spheres, perhaps with a real apple twig inserted as a stalk. These meat apples would then be cooked and possibly coloured to resemble real fruit, only to provide a savoury surprise when bitten into. It's the kind of culinary joke that would have medieval diners chuckling into their goblets, assuming they didn't break a tooth on an unexpected meatball. These illusions weren't just about trickery for its own sake. They demonstrated the cook's mastery over his ingredients, his ability to transform humble foodstuffs into marvels, to bend nature to his will, much like the king bent his kingdom to his. There was an element of the alchemical, of turning base materials into something golden and wondrous. The more convincing the illusion, or the more fantastical the subtlety, the greater the oohs and ahs from the guests, and the more prestige accrued to the host. Historians still argue about the extent to which these subtleties were actually eaten. Some of the larger, more decorative pieces, especially those incorporating non-edible elements, or vast amounts of expensive sugar, might have been more for display, to be admired and then perhaps broken up and distributed as tokens. Smaller, clearly edible subtleties, however, would certainly have been consumed. The line between food and art was deliciously blurred. Was it a dessert, an intercourse amusement, or a political statement? Yes. So, as a magnificent sugar-paste dragon, breathing spun sugar flames and perhaps carrying a banner with the king's motto, is paraded around the hall, you understand that this feast is about so much more than just eating. It's about spectacle, about wonder, about the sheer, unadulterated joy of creation and illusion. These subtleties and food tricks are a vital part of the tapestry of the royal banquet, adding a layer of playful artifice and dazzling craftsmanship to the already impressive display of abundance. They are a reminder that in the medieval world, food could be fun, fantastical, and deeply, surprisingly clever. Just be careful what you bite into, it might not be what you think it is. The fantastical subtleties have been admired, their sugary battlements perhaps sampled, their edible illusions chuckled over. The main courses, a seemingly endless procession of meats and fish, have largely run their race, but the medieval feast is not quite ready to release you from its delicious calorie-laden embrace. Just as you're starting to loosen your belt, or whatever medieval equivalent you're sporting, and contemplate the sheer physics of how much food one human can reasonably ingest, a new wave of dishes begins to appear. It's time for the sweet endings, the royal desserts, a course that might surprise you with its range and sophistication, proving that the medieval sweet tooth was just as developed, if not more so, than our own. Now, when you think medieval dessert, you might picture something fairly rustic, perhaps a simple baked apple or a hunk of cheese with some honey. And while those certainly existed, a royal feast would offer far more elaborate and varied sweet treats. Sugar, as we've discussed, was a luxury item, a symbol of wealth, and its presence in the dessert course was another opportunity for the king to display his riches. Honey, of course, had been the primary sweetener for millennia and continued to be widely used, lending its distinctive floral notes to many creations. But the increasing availability of cane sugar opened up new possibilities for confectioners. One of the most common and beloved categories of medieval dessert was fruit-based. Fresh fruits, when in season, would be served, often artfully arranged. Think bowls of ripe berries, juicy plums, sweet cherries, or crisp apples and pears. But fruits were also cooked in myriad ways. Tarts and pies filled with apples, pears, cherries, or other fruits were incredibly popular. These weren't necessarily the double-crust pies we often see today. They might be open-faced tarts, or coffins, pastry cases, filled with spiced fruit mixtures. Imagine a warm pear tart, the fruit poached in red wine and sweetened with honey and cinnamon, its pastry crisp and golden, or a dariole, a type of custard tart, which could be sweet or savoury, but often appeared in sweet versions flavoured with rosewater or almonds. Preserved fruits also played a big role. Dried fruits like raisins, figs, and dates, imported from warmer climes, were luxury items and featured prominently in sweet dishes, often mixed with nuts and spices. Fruits could also be preserved in honey or sugar syrup, creating intensely sweet concoctions known as suckets, or wet suckets, fruits and syrup, and dry suckets, candied or crystallized fruits. These were like medieval fruit candies, jewel-toned and intensely flavored. You might be offered a dish of glistening candied orange peel, or syrupy figs infused with ginger. Custards and cream-based desserts were also highly favoured, though again different from their modern, often very light counterparts. Medieval custards, like cordelles or creams, were frequently richer and denser, often thickened with egg yolks and breadcrumbs or ground almonds. They might be baked, like a modern creme brulee, minus the blowtorch of course. Glazing was often done with a hot iron or by sprinkling sugar and briefly returning to the oven, or served as a thick spoonable dessert. Almond milk made by steeping ground almonds in water or wine was a very common ingredient in medieval cooking, especially for custards and creamy sauces, partly because it was a permissible ingredient on fast days when cow's milk was forbidden. So you might enjoy a delicate almond cream, sweetened with sugar and flavoured with rosewater or mace. Then there were the fritters. Oh, the glorious medieval fritter! These were essentially deep-fried little dough balls or pieces of fruit, often dusted with sugar or drizzled with honey. Apple fritters were a particular favourite, but you might also find fritters made with other fruits, or even flowers like elderflower blossoms, dipped in batter and fried until golden and crisp. They were the medieval equivalent of donuts or beignets, a delightful combination of crispy fried dough and sweet flavouring. You can almost hear the satisfying crunch, followed by a sigh of pure sugary contentment. A mainstream historical fact is that many of the spices we now associate primarily with savoury dishes, like ginger, cloves, cinnamon and nutmeg, were used just as extensively in medieval sweet dishes. The line between sweet and savoury was much more blurred than it is in modern Western cuisine. So, your sweet fruit pie might also contain a pinch of pepper, or your spiced wine, hippocras which we'll get to, would be heavily laden with cinnamon and ginger. One quirky and rather charming medieval sweet treat was leech, or leisha. This was a sort of jelly-like confection, often made with milk or almond milk, sugar, and a setting agent like isinglass, derived from fish bladders, delicious, right, or gelatin. Leeches could be flavoured and coloured in various ways, often with spices or fruit purees, and then cut into decorative shapes. Leche Lombard was a particularly popular version, often involving dates, wine, and spices. It was like a medieval panna cotta, or a very firm blancmange, and could be quite beautiful, especially if layered with different colours. Imagine a chessboard pattern made of alternating light and dark leech squares. Wafers, thin, crisp biscuits, were also a common accompaniment to the dessert course, often served with sweet-spiced wine for dipping. These weren't your plain bland wafers. They were frequently flavoured with sugar, cinnamon, or other spices, and cooked in special long-handled irons over the fire. similar to modern pitzel irons. Sometimes they were rolled into tubes while still warm. Having a dedicated waferer in the royal household was a sign of a truly well-equipped culinary setup. Historians still argue about the exact definition and evolution of dessert as a distinct course in medieval banquets. The word itself, from the Old French desservir, to clear the table, suggests it was originally what was served after the main table had been cleared. The lines could be blurry, with sweet dishes sometimes appearing alongside savoury ones in earlier medieval feasts. But by the later Middle Ages, a distinct sweet course was becoming more common, especially at the most elaborate banquets. So, as the remnants of the main courses are cleared away, perhaps including your gravy-soaked trencher, destined for the alms basket, and the sweet delicacies begin to arrive, you're entering the final phase of this epic culinary journey. From jewel-like candied fruits and fragrant spiced tarts to creamy custards and crispy fritters, the royal dessert course is a testament to the medieval love of sweetness and the skill of the royal confectioners. It's a delightful coda to the symphony of flavours you've experienced, a sweet reminder that even in an age often perceived as harsh and unrefined, there was plenty of room for indulgence, artistry, and the pure, simple joy of a well-made dessert. Just try to save a little room for the spiced wine that's likely to accompany it. The sweet delicacies have been savoured. Their sugary, spicy notes a delightful counterpoint to the rich meats and fish that came before. Your trencher, if you didn't eat it, has been dutifully collected. But a feast of this magnitude isn't just about the food, it's also about what you're drinking. And at a medieval royal banquet, you can be sure that the beverages flowed as freely, if not more so, than the sauces and gravies. Quenching the thirst of hundreds of feasting nobles, knights, and assorted hangers-on required a cellar of epic proportions and a constant supply of wine, ale, and mead, the holy trinity of medieval libations. Throughout the meal, from the first morsel of bread to the last crumb of candied fruit, your goblet would have been kept diligently filled by attentive servants. The most prestigious beverage, the drink of kings, nobles, and the high clergy, was undoubtedly wine. This wasn't necessarily the finely aged single vineyard vintage you might find in a modern wine shop. Medieval wines were generally younger, consumed closer to their production date, and often less stable than modern wines due to differences in viticulture and winemaking techniques. However, vast quantities were produced and consumed. England, despite its cooler climate, had a significant winemaking industry in the Middle Ages, particularly in the south. But the real powerhouses of wine production were regions like Gascony in France, which was under English rule for a significant period, leading to a massive export trade of claret, a lighter red wine, to England. Spain, Italy, and the Rhine Valley in Germany were also major wine-producing regions. The wines themselves would have varied. You'd have red wines, white wines, and rosé, often called vin gris or claret. Some wines were light and fruity, intended for easy drinking, while others were richer and more potent. Because wines didn't always travel well or last long, they were often drunk relatively young, and sometimes corrected or improved upon arrival with various additions. It wasn't uncommon to spice wine not just for flavour, but also sometimes to mask off tastes, or to give it a perceived medicinal boost. This brings us to Hippocras. Hippocras, or Hippocras, was a hugely popular spiced wine, essentially the medieval version of mulled wine, though it could be served warm or cold. It was typically made by mixing wine, red or white, with sugar or honey, and a potent blend of spices such as cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, mace, grains of paradise, a peppery spice from West Africa, and long pepper. The mixture would be strained through a conical cloth bag called a manicum hippocraticum, sleeve of Hippocrates, which is how it got its name, though its connection to the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates is tenuous at best. Hippocras was considered a luxurious and digestive drink, often served at the end of a meal with the sweet course, or as a special treat. It was sweet, aromatic, and warming, a perfect way to settle a stomach full of roasted peacock and eel pie. You can imagine the rich, Christmassy aroma filling the air as flagons of Hippocras were poured. While wine was the high-status drink, the everyday beverage for much of the population, including many in the royal household, was ale. Ale in the medieval period was different from modern beer in one crucial respect. It was typically unhopped. Hops, which act as a preservative and add a bitter flavour, only became widely used in brewing in England and many parts of Europe towards the later Middle Ages. Medieval ale was made from malted barley, water, and yeast, often the same barm used for bread making. It was brewed in various strengths, from small ale, a weak low-alcohol brew that was drunk throughout the day by everyone, including children, as a safer alternative to often unsanitary water, to strong ale, a potent, intoxicating brew reserved for special occasions and serious merrymaking. The royal household would have had its own brew house, producing vast quantities of ale to satisfy the thirst of its many members and guests. A feast would see an almost unimaginable consumption of ale. Each person might be allocated a gallon or more per day as part of their livery or allowance. It was the fuel that kept the lower echelons of the feast going. Then there was mead, an ancient drink made by fermenting honey and water. Mead could be flavoured with spices, herbs, or fruit, creating varieties like metheglin, spiced mead, or melomel, fruit mead. While perhaps less common than wine or ale by the High Middle Ages in some regions, mead still held a place of honour, particularly in areas with strong Celtic or Germanic traditions, or where grapes didn't grow well. It had a mythical, almost legendary status, associated with poetry, celebration, and the halls of ancient heroes. A well-made mead, sweet and potent with the aroma of honey, would have been a welcome addition to the feasting table. A mainstream historical fact is that water, while obviously essential for life, was often viewed with suspicion as a beverage in the Middle Ages, particularly in urban areas, due to concerns about contamination. Weak ale or wine were often considered safer and more hygienic alternatives. This doesn't mean people didn't drink water, but it wasn't typically the first choice at a feast if other options were available. A quirky and somewhat potent beverage you might encounter, especially if the king had a particularly well-stocked cellar or a taste for the exotic, was kavizia, a type of beer that might include ingredients beyond the standard malt, water, and yeast. Some of these could be quite strong and uniquely flavoured. There were also fruit wines or ciders made from apples, cider or pommage, and pears, perry. These were particularly common in regions like Normandy and parts of England where orchards abounded. They offered a lighter, fruitier alternative to ale and grape wine. The serving of these drinks was also steeped in ritual. The royal cupbearer was a position of great trust and honour. He would be responsible for tasting the king's wine before serving it, ostensibly to check for poison, a very real concern for medieval monarchs. Goblets would be made of various materials, from simple wood or pottery for the lower tables, to pewter, silver, or even gold for the high table, sometimes encrusted with gems. Sharing a cup was also a common practice, a sign of fellowship, though hopefully your cupmate didn't have a terrible cold. Historians still argue about the overall levels of alcohol consumption in the Middle Ages and its societal impact. While some contemporary accounts paint a picture of constant heavy drinking, others suggest that the weaker small ales were more about hydration and nutrition than intoxication. However, at a feast, it's safe to say that inhibitions were lowered and spirits were high, thanks in no small part to the generous flow of potent potables. So, as your goblet is refilled with ruby-red Gascon claret, or perhaps a fragrant cup of golden mead, or even just a sturdy draught of strong ale, take a moment to appreciate the sheer variety and volume of liquid refreshment on offer. From the vineyards of distant France to the local brewhouse humming with activity, a vast network of production and supply was dedicated to ensuring that no one at the king's feast went thirsty. These drinks were not just an accompaniment to the food, they were an integral part of the celebration, fueling the conversation, the laughter, and the general bonhomie of the occasion. Cheers, or as they might have said, wassail. The wine, ale, and mead are flowing. The air is thick with the mingled aromas of spiced hippocras and roasting meats, and the sweet course has left a pleasant sugary warmth on your palate. You're feeling quite the seasoned feaster by now. But before you get too comfortable reaching for another piece of that gilded marzipan, let's take a closer look at the stage upon which this grand culinary drama unfolds. The royal table itself. The way the table was set, the utensils, or lack thereof, and the various accoutrements all played a crucial role in the feasting experience, reflecting status, social hierarchy, and the practicalities of consuming such an elaborate meal. It wasn't just about plonking down plates, it was a carefully orchestrated presentation. First, picture the tables. In the Great Hall, these were typically long trestle tables, sturdy wooden planks laid across trestles or supports. They could be easily dismantled and stored, making the hall a versatile space for other activities when not used for dining. The most important table, of course, was the high table, often set on a dais or raised platform at one end of the hall. This is where the king, his family, and the most distinguished guests would be seated, literally elevated above the rest of the diners. The high table would be covered with the finest linen tablecloths, perhaps embroidered or damasked, their whiteness a symbol of purity and wealth. Lower tables might have simpler cloths, or sometimes none at all, depending on the rank of the diners. You definitely want to be seated at a table with a cloth. It was a clear indicator you were someone of note. Now, let's talk about what's on the table. Individual plates as we know them were not standard for most of the medieval period. Remember those bread trenchers we discussed? For many diners, especially at the lower tables, the trencher was their primary eating surface. You'd get your square of stale bread, and your food would be served directly onto it. At the high table, however, you might find more elaborate arrangements. Wealthy diners might use plates made of pewter, silver, or even gold, especially for later courses or for particularly messy dishes. But even then, sharing was common. Food was often served on large communal platters, and diners would take portions from these platters to place on their trenchers or individual plates if they had them. One of the most important items on any medieval table, high or low, was salt. Salt was a precious commodity, essential for preserving food and enhancing its flavour. Its presentation on the table was a significant marker of status. At the high table, you would find an elaborate salt cellar, often a large ornate container made of silver, gold, or other valuable materials, sometimes fantastically sculpted into the shape of a ship, a nef, a castle, or an animal. This was the Great Salt. Lesser tables would have smaller, simpler salt cellars. The phrase below the salt referred to being seated at the lower end of the table, further away from the Great Salt and the most honoured guests, signifying a lower social standing. Where you sat in relation to the salt cellar spoke volumes about your place in the pecking order. It was the medieval equivalent of being seated at the kids' table, but with more feudal implications. As for cutlery, prepare to get your hands dirty. The primary eating utensil for most people was their own personal knife, which they would bring with them, often carried in a sheath on their belt. This knife was an all-purpose tool used for cutting meat, spearing food, and pretty much everything else. Spoons were also used, especially for soups, stews, and saucy dishes. These could be made of wood, horn, pewter, or precious metals for the wealthy, but the fork? That was a different story. While forks had been known in some parts of Europe, notably Byzantium and Italy, for centuries, their adoption in Northern Europe, including England and France, was very slow. For much of the medieval period, using a fork was seen as an affectation, even effeminate or unmanly. One mainstream historical fact is that forks were not commonly used for eating at the English royal court until well into the 17th century. So, for most of your medieval feasting, you'd be relying on your knife, your spoon, and nature's own utensils, your fingers. This is why hand-washing before and during the meal was important, with servants often circulating with basins of water and linen towels. Goblets and cups for drinking would also be present, again varying in material and elegance depending on the diner's status. Wooden mazer cups, pewter tankards, silver goblets, and perhaps even delicate imported glassware for the king himself. Sharing a cup with a table companion was a sign of camaraderie, though it probably also spread a fair few medieval germs. Just try not to think about it too much and enjoy your hippocras. Napkins or naperi were certainly used, especially by the upper classes, given the hands-on nature of medieval dining. These would be made of linen and could be quite large. They were essential for wiping greasy fingers and mouths. Sometimes, elaborate napkin folding was even practiced, a precursor to the fancy swan-shaped napkins you see at some restaurants today, though probably less swan and more functional rectangle. A quirky and rather charming table accessory you might see at a very grand feast was the alms dish. This was a special dish placed on the table into which diners could put aside portions of food to be given to the poor after the meal. It was a visible demonstration of Christian charity, a reminder that even in the midst of such opulence, there was an obligation to care for the less fortunate. It was also a handy way to discreetly dispose of any bits you didn't fancy, under the guise of piety. Oh, this roasted squirrel's head, straight to the alms dish for some deserving peasant. Historians still argue about the precise level of refinement at medieval tables. While some contemporary accounts and sumptuary laws suggest efforts to maintain order and decorum, others paint a picture of a more boisterous, messy and even chaotic dining experience, especially at very large gatherings. The reality probably lay somewhere in between, varying greatly depending on the specific occasion, the host, and the company. So, as you look around the great hall, observing the gleaming silver of the great salt, the crisp white linen on the high table, the simpler wooden trenchers further down, and the busy servants ensuring goblets are filled and hands are relatively clean, you realise that the setting of the royal table is as much a part of the feast's message as the food itself. It's a microcosm of the medieval social order, a visual representation of hierarchy, wealth, and the customs of the age. Every object, from the grandest golden platter to the humblest wooden spoon, tells a story about the people who used it and the world they inhabited. Now, if you'll excuse me, I think my trencher is getting a bit soggy. Time for a fresh one. The table is set, a landscape of linen, trenchers, and gleaming salt cellars. Your goblet is full, your personal knife is at the ready, and you're surrounded by the sights, sounds, and smells of a royal feast in full swing. You've navigated the menu from the forest game to the fish day delicacies, from the impressive subtleties to the sweet desserts. But consuming this magnificent meal isn't just a matter of appetite, it's a performance, governed by a complex and often unwritten code of conduct. Welcome to the intricate world of medieval feast etiquette and manners, where a misplaced elbow or an ill-timed belch could at best mark you as a boor, and at worst cause serious offence. Getting this right is almost as important as remembering which end of the roasted peacock to carve. First and foremost, seating arrangements were paramount and non-negotiable. As we've touched upon, the high table was for the host, the king in our case, and the most honoured guests. Proximity to the king signified favour and importance. Further down the hall, guests were seated according to rank and status. Being placed below the salt was a clear indication of your lower position in the hierarchy. You didn't just plonk yourself down wherever you fancied. There was a strict order, and to challenge it would be a grave social error. If you found yourself seated next to a particularly pungent baron who insisted on telling you about his latest boil, well, you just had to smile and nod. Complaining about your seat was not an option. Once seated, the rituals began. Hand-washing was crucial, given the finger-food nature of much of the dining. Servants, often young pages of noble birth learning the arts of service, would circulate with ewers, pitchers of scented water and basins, and offer linen towels for drying. This wasn't just about hygiene, it was a polite and necessary ceremony before handling food that others might also share from communal dishes. Dipping your grimy paws directly into the communal stew was a definite no-no. When it came to actually eating, remember, fingers first, for many items. You'd use your knife to cut larger pieces of meat on your trencher, and then you'd convey smaller, manageable pieces to your mouth with your fingers. It was considered polite to use only 3 fingers, thumb, index and middle, and to keep your hand relatively clean. No licking your fingers excessively, and definitely no double dipping into communal dishes. If you were sharing a dish with a neighbour, which was common with food often served for messes of 2 or 4 people, you'd take your portion neatly and avoid rummaging through the dish for the best bits. That was considered terribly greedy. The medieval equivalent of taking all the cashews out of the mixed nuts. Speaking of sharing, it was also common to share a drinking goblet with your immediate table companion. This was a sign of fellowship. When drinking, it was polite to wipe your mouth with your napkin before drinking from a shared cup, so as not to leave a greasy film on the rim for your companion. Thoughtful, really, in an era before individual Dixie cups. Your napkin or serviette was your best friend. It was to be used frequently to wipe your mouth and fingers. Don't tuck it into your collar like a bib, that was for children. Lay it neatly in your lap or over your shoulder, and definitely don't blow your nose on it. That's what sleeves were for. Just kidding, mostly. Personal hygiene standards were, shall we say, different, but blowing your nose directly into the communal tablecloth was generally frowned upon. Pace yourself. A royal feast was a marathon, not a sprint, with multiple courses served over several hours. Don't wolf down your food as if you haven't eaten in a week, even if you haven't. Eat moderately, savour the flavours, and engage in polite conversation with your neighbours. Stuffing your mouth too full was considered vulgar. One contemporary book of manners, Les Contenances de la Table, advised diners not to lean upon your elbow, nor yet your hand upon the table. Good posture was expected, no slouching over your trencher like a gargoyle. Then there were the bodily functions. What about burping or other emissions? Generally, these were to be avoided or done as discreetly as possible. While standards of discretion might vary from our own, openly belching in the king's face was unlikely to win you any favours. If you had to cough or sneeze, turn away from the table. A mainstream historical fact is the existence of numerous courtesy books, or etiquette manuals from the medieval and early modern periods, which provided detailed instructions on proper table manners, personal conduct, and social graces. These books were intended to help aspiring courtiers and members of the gentry navigate the complexities of polite society. They covered everything from how to carve meat to how not to spit across the table. One quirky and slightly endearing piece of etiquette advice often found in these manuals was about bones. What do you do with the bones from your meat? Don't just toss them on the floor, though this certainly happened, much to the delight of the dogs who often roamed the great hall. It was considered more polite to place them neatly on the side of your trencher, or sometimes on a separate voiding plate if one was provided. And definitely don't gnaw on them too aggressively or throw them at other guests, no matter how tempting that soused gurnard looks on Sir Reginald's plate. Conversation was, of course, a key part of the feast, but here too there were rules. Speak clearly, but not too loudly. Don't interrupt others, especially those of higher rank. Avoid contentious topics, unless the king himself brings them up, in which case agree enthusiastically. Gossip was probably rife, but one had to be careful about who might be listening. Compliments to the host on the quality of the food and wine were always a good idea, and if the king made a joke, you laughed, heartily, even if it wasn't funny, especially if it wasn't funny. Historians still argue about how consistently these rules of etiquette were actually followed, and by whom. Were they ideals promoted in courtesy books but largely ignored in the boisterous reality of a crowded feast? Or were they strictly enforced, with social penalties for infractions? The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle, with behaviour varying depending on the formality of the occasion and the specific company. At a solemn state banquet, manners would be more rigidly observed than at a rowdy post-hunt celebration. So, as you carefully select a piece of pheasant with your hopefully clean fingers, engage in polite small talk with the bejewelled countess to your left, and try not to spill hippocras down your best tunic, you realise that dining at a royal feast is a delicate dance. It's about showing respect, demonstrating your own good breeding, or at least your ability to fake it, and navigating the social currents as skillfully as you navigate the food. Get it right, and you affirm your place in this glittering world. Get it wrong, and you might find your next invitation mysteriously lost in the post. Or worse, you become the subject of courtly ridicule, the baron who ate like a boar, and nobody wants that. You've mastered the art of eating with your fingers, mostly. You're navigating the conversational currents like a seasoned diplomat, and your napkin is, impressively, still relatively pristine. The food and drink are undeniably central to the royal feast, but the experience isn't just about what goes into your mouth. A medieval banquet, especially one hosted by a king, was a full-blown sensory assault, a multimedia extravaganza designed to entertain and delight all the senses, not just taste and smell. As the courses progress and the wine flows, the great hall would come alive with a rich tapestry of sound and spectacle. Forget a polite string quartet playing in the corner. We're talking about a vibrant, sometimes raucous, programme of entertainment. Dominating the soundscape, and often positioned in a gallery overlooking the great hall, would be the minstrels. This wasn't just a lone lute player strumming mournfully. A royal household would employ a troupe of musicians, skilled on a variety of instruments. You'd hear the bright, clear notes of trumpets and shawms, a loud, oboe-like wind instrument, heralding the arrival of important courses or dignitaries. The gentler sounds of lutes, harps, and vielles, a medieval fiddle, would provide a more melodic accompaniment to the meal and conversation. Percussion instruments like tabors, small drums, nakers, kettle drums, and cymbals would add rhythm and excitement. The music wasn't just background noise, it was an integral part of the feasting atmosphere, setting the mood, adding to the sense of occasion, and sometimes even accompanying dances if the mood struck and space allowed after the tables were cleared. One mainstream historical fact is that minstrels were often highly mobile, travelling from court to court, and their performances were a key way for news, stories, and musical trends to spread across different regions. They were the medieval Spotify, but live and in person. But music was just the beginning. Professional storytellers, or jesters, might recount epic tales of chivalry, romance, or heroic battles, the medieval equivalent of an audiobook, but with more dramatic flair and probably better eye contact. These stories, like the Chanson de Roland or Tales of King Arthur and his knights, reinforced the values of the aristocratic warrior class and provided thrilling entertainment. Imagine listening to a vivid account of a dragon slaying or a daring rescue while you're tucking into your slice of wild boar. It certainly beats scrolling through social media between bites. Then there were the jesters, or fools. These weren't just clowns in silly hats, though the hats were often quite something. A skilled court jester was often a sharp-witted satirist, an acrobat, a musician, and a comedian all rolled into one. They had a unique license to speak truth to power, albeit cloaked in humour, and could poke fun at the nobles, the clergy, and even the king himself, as long as they didn't go too far. Their antics, riddles, and jokes provided levity and amusement, a welcome counterpoint to the more formal aspects of the feast. A good jester could have the whole hall roaring with laughter, a much-needed release after perhaps a rather heavy course of pike stewed in almond milk. Their humour could be slapstick, satirical, or surprisingly sophisticated. Acrobats, tumblers, and jugglers would also frequently perform, showcasing their physical prowess and dexterity. Imagine performers somersaulting between the tables, hopefully not too close to the flaming torches, or jugglers keeping an improbable number of knives or flaming brands in the air. These acts added a visual thrill, a sense of circus-like spectacle to the proceedings. Sometimes animal acts might even be included, with trained dogs performing tricks, or perhaps even more exotic creatures if the king had a well-stocked menagerie. Remember those live birds flying out of a pie? That was entertainment and food combined, a truly medieval multimedia moment. Dancing was another popular form of entertainment, though usually occurring after the main feasting was done, and some of the tables had been cleared to make space. The dances would range from stately processional dances like the carol or a stampy, where participants moved in elegant prescribed patterns, to more lively and energetic affairs. The king and queen might lead the first dance, a symbolic opening of the festivities. It was a chance for the nobles to show off their grace, their fine clothes, and perhaps engage in a bit of polite flirtation. A quirky and rather theatrical form of entertainment that sometimes appeared at very grand feasts was the mummery, or disguising. This involved a group of performers, often nobles themselves, dressing up in elaborate costumes, perhaps as exotic foreigners, mythical beasts, or allegorical figures, and entering the hall to perform a short, often silent, play or dance. These could be quite lavish and mysterious, adding an element of mask-like fantasy to the evening. You might suddenly see a group of wild men covered in leaves and fur burst into the hall, perform a strange dance, and then vanish as quickly as they appeared, leaving the guests to wonder what on earth they'd just witnessed. It was all part of the spectacle. The presentation of the food itself, especially those elaborate subtleties we discussed, was a form of entertainment. The oohs and ahs as a giant sugar castle or a peacock redressed in its feathers was paraded through the hall were as much a part of the experience as the music or the jesters' jokes. Even the ceremonial carving of a great joint of meat by a skilled carver could be a performance in itself, watched with appreciation by the diners. Historians still argue about the exact nature and prevalence of some of the more theatrical entertainments, particularly the more elaborate mummings or indoor pageants. Were these common occurrences, or reserved for only the most exceptional state occasions? The records are often fragmentary, but they suggest a rich and varied tradition of feasting entertainment, designed to impress upon the guests the magnificence and cultural sophistication of the royal court. So, as the last notes of a lute melody fade and the jester takes a well-earned bow, perhaps after narrowly avoiding a thrown bread roll from a less than amused duke, you realise that a royal feast was a full-bodied experience. It was a symphony of tastes, sights, and sounds, carefully orchestrated to create an unforgettable impression of power, plenty, and pleasure. The entertainment wasn't just a sideshow, it was an essential ingredient transforming a mere meal into a memorable event, a story to be told and retold. It was dinner and a show, medieval style, and you had a front row seat. Just try not to get too distracted by the juggler with the flaming torches. You wouldn't want to miss the next course of spiced wine. The minstrels are playing a livelier stampede, the jester just landed a particularly sharp barb at a notoriously pompous bishop who is trying very hard not to look amused, and the scent of Hippocras hangs heavy in the air, mingling with the lingering aromas of a dozen different dishes. You're well into the feasting experience now, not just a passive observer, but an active participant in this grand medieval spectacle. Let's take a moment to fully immerse ourselves in the overall atmosphere of the Great Hall to soak in the sights, sounds, and yes, even the smells that collectively define this unique environment. It's a far cry from a quiet, candlelit dinner for two. The Great Hall itself is a key player in setting the scene. These were typically the largest and most impressive rooms in any castle or palace, designed to accommodate hundreds of people. Think vast, high-ceilinged spaces, often with exposed timber beams arching overhead like the ribs of a great wooden whale. The walls might be hung with rich tapestries, not just for decoration, but also to provide some insulation against the stone wall's chill, and to help dampen the echoes in such a cavernous space. These tapestries would depict scenes of hunting, battles, biblical stories, or coats of arms, their vibrant colours and intricate details adding to the visual splendour. Banners bearing the heraldic devices of the king and his most important nobles might also adorn the walls, a constant reminder of the power structures at play. Lighting, in an era before electricity, was a crucial element of the atmosphere. During the day, light would stream in through tall, often narrow windows, perhaps glazed with small panes of greenish or yellowish glass, a luxury, or simply covered with oiled linen or wooden shutters. But as evening descended, and for a feast that would undoubtedly stretch long into the night, the hall would be illuminated by a multitude of flaming torches set in wall sconces, and by candles, lots and lots of candles. Beeswax candles, which burned cleaner and smelled sweeter, were a luxury reserved for the high table and the wealthiest households. Tallow candles made from animal fat were more common for general illumination, and they had a distinct, somewhat greasy smell and produced more smoke. The flickering, dancing light from these hundreds of sources would cast long, dramatic shadows, making the tapestries seem to shimmer, and the faces of your fellow diners appear and disappear in the warm, uncertain glow. It would be a far cry from the even, steady light of a modern dining room. This was a living, breathing light, full of movement and mystery. The sounds, as we've noted, were a complex symphony. The music from the minstrel's gallery, the jester's patter, the storyteller's recitations, the clatter of serving dishes, the murmur and sometimes roar of hundreds of conversations, the occasional bark of a hunting dog hoping for a dropped morsel, the scrape of benches, the clinking of goblets, all these would blend into a rich auditory tapestry. It wouldn't be quiet. A royal feast was a lively, boisterous affair, especially as the wine flowed more freely and inhibitions were loosened. Laughter would echo through the hall, punctuated by cheers for a particularly impressive dish or a well-received performance. You'd have to raise your voice to be heard by your immediate neighbours, contributing to the overall energetic hum of the event. And then there are the smells. Oh, the smells of a medieval great hall during a feast. It would be an olfactory assault, a potent cocktail of the sublime and the, well, less sublime. You'd have the delicious aromas of roasting meats, baking bread, fragrant spices, and sweet wine. But these would mingle with other, more earthy scents. The smoke from the torches and tallow candles, the smell of damp wool and fur from the guests' clothing, the faint but persistent aroma of unwashed bodies — daily bathing wasn't a universal practice even among the nobility — the scent of dogs, and perhaps even the lingering smell of the rushes or herbs strewn on the floor. These rushes were intended to absorb spills, dropped food, and other detritus, and while they might be mixed with fragrant herbs like lavender or chamomile, after a few hours of feasting, they'd be contributing their own unique, slightly musty organic note to the overall perfume of the hall. It's a smell you probably wouldn't bottle and sell as eau de médiéval banquet, but it was undeniably authentic. The sheer number of people packed into the hall would also contribute to the atmosphere. Great halls were often crowded, with diners squeezed onto benches, servants bustling back and forth, entertainers performing, and dogs weaving their way underfoot. Personal space was a modern luxury. You'd be rubbing shoulders, quite literally, with your fellow feasters. This proximity, while perhaps a bit much for modern sensibilities, fostered a sense of communal experience, of shared celebration. It was a very human, very tactile environment. A mainstream historical fact. The layout of the Great Hall, with the high table on a dais, and other tables arranged perpendicularly or parallel in the main body of the hall, reinforce the social hierarchy. Even the doorways and screens passages, corridors often separated from the main hall by a carved wooden screen, leading to the kitchens and buttery, were part of this carefully managed space, controlling access and movement. One quirky and often overlooked aspect of the Great Hall's atmosphere was the presence of those aforementioned dogs. Not just lapdogs, but often large hunting hounds, were common fixtures in medieval halls. They served a practical purpose, cleaning up dropped scraps of food, but also added to the general sense of informal, aristocratic life. A noble might casually toss a bone to his favourite hound lounging at his feet. It's a charming image, though probably not one that would pass modern food hygiene inspections. "Excuse me, Sir Knight, is that your wolfhound currently sniffing my trencher?" Historians still argue about the level of order versus chaos in a typical medieval feasting hall. While etiquette manuals stress decorum, the reality, especially at very large or boisterous feasts, could be quite different. Was it a scene of stately, well-managed magnificence, or more akin to a very well-catered, slightly out-of-control medieval frat party? The answer probably varied enormously, but it's safe to say there was a robust energy, a vibrancy that is hard to capture in mere words. So, as you sit there, the torchlight flickering on the tapestries, the sound of a lute competing with the booming laugh of a nearby baron, the complex aromas filling your nostrils, and the warmth of the crowd and the wine suffusing you, you're truly in it. This is the heart of the medieval royal feast, not just a collection of dishes and drinks, but a living, breathing, multi-sensory experience. It's a place where power is displayed, society is reinforced, and pleasure is pursued with gusto. It's a world away from your quiet kitchen table, a vibrant, sometimes overwhelming, but utterly unforgettable immersion into the past. Just try not to trip over a sleeping greyhound on your way to compliment the king on his excellent choice of subtlety. The crescendo of the feast has passed. The last subtlety has been admired, the final dregs of Hippocras have been drained from the jewelled goblets, and even the most dedicated trencherman is starting to look a little glazed. The minstrels might be playing a softer, more contemplative tune, or perhaps they've packed up their lutes and shawms entirely. Pages and servants, weary but still diligent, are beginning the mammoth task of clearing the tables. But what happens to the food? Given the almost unimaginable quantities prepared for a royal feast, mountains of meat, legions of pies, oceans of pottage, there must have been leftovers, and indeed there were, often in staggering amounts. The fate of these remnants tells us a lot about medieval society, its notions of charity, economy, and even its understanding of waste. It wasn't a case of simply scraping everything into the medieval equivalent of a dumpster. Food was too valuable, too hard-won for such profligate waste, even in a royal household that prided itself on conspicuous consumption. The concept of largesse, or generous giving, was deeply ingrained in the aristocratic code, and the distribution of leftover food was a key way for the king and his nobles to display this virtue. It was also a practical way to maintain goodwill and manage resources. A significant portion of the leftovers from the high table, and often from the other tables as well, would be collected and distributed as alms to the poor. Remember the alms dish we mentioned, where diners could place choice morsels? That was just a small part of it. The almoner, a household official often a member of the clergy, was specifically responsible for collecting and distributing these charitable donations. Crowds of less fortunate folk, the local poor, itinerant beggars, perhaps even humble friars, would often gather at the castle gates after a great feast, hoping for a share of the king's bounty. Receiving food from the royal table, even if it was just a half-gnawed capon leg or a slightly squashed tart, was not only a material benefit, but also a symbolic connection to the king's generosity and power. It was good PR for the crown, demonstrating that the king cared for all his subjects, even the humblest. Not all leftovers went directly to the poor, however. The royal household itself was vast, encompassing not just the nobles and high-ranking officials you see in the Great Hall, but also a huge retinue of servants, guards, grooms, kitchen staff, and all their dependents. Many of these individuals would be fed from the remnants of the feast. The better quality leftovers from the higher tables would often descend through the household hierarchy. What the king, and his immediate circle didn't eat might go to the lesser nobles or knights, what they left might go to the senior servants, and so on down the line. It was a system of internal recycling, ensuring that as little as possible was wasted and that everyone in the extended royal family, in the broadest sense, got a taste of the feasting. The scullions in the kitchen, after a long day of scrubbing greasy pots, might finally get to sample some of the delicacies they'd helped prepare, albeit in a slightly less pristine state. Then there were the animals. We've already noted the presence of dogs in the Great Hall, eagerly snapping up dropped scraps and discarded bones. The royal kennels would house many more hunting hounds, and they too would benefit from the feast's leftovers. Bones, gristle, and other less choice meaty bits would be a welcome supplement to their diet. Pigs, too, were the great recyclers of the medieval world, capable of eating almost anything. Any food scraps deemed unsuitable for human consumption, or for the more discerning hounds, would likely end up as pigs will, fattening up the very animals that might one day grace a future feasting table. It's the medieval circle of life, with a lot of bacon involved. Preservation techniques also played a role in managing leftovers, though on a smaller scale after such a large event. Some cooked meats, if properly handled, could be preserved for a short time, perhaps by being potted in fat or incorporated into other dishes for the following day's meals for the household. Pies and pastries, by their nature, kept relatively well for a day or two. However, the sheer volume from a major feast meant that immediate consumption or distribution was the primary strategy. A mainstream historical fact is that the office of the Royal Almoner was a significant and long-standing position in many European courts. In England, the Grand Almoner is still a great officer of the royal household, with ceremonial duties that include distributing Maundy money, a tradition with roots in the charitable practices of medieval monarchs. One quirky, and perhaps slightly stomach-churning aspect of medieval leftovers involved second-hand food. Sometimes partially eaten items, especially from the high table, might be reformed or represented for consumption by those lower down the social scale. A half-eaten pie might have its remaining contents tidied up and served again. This wasn't necessarily seen as unhygienic by medieval standards, but rather as a practical way of utilising all available food. It does make you appreciate your own untouched plate of food a little more, doesn't it? Anyone for a lightly used trencher, still damp with ducal gravy? The concept of waste as we understand it today, something to be minimised for environmental or economic reasons, was different. While food was valuable, the act of providing an overwhelming abundance, even if it meant significant leftovers, was itself a powerful statement. The largesse shown in distributing those leftovers was part of that statement. The waste was, in a sense, performative, a demonstration that the king could afford to be so generous, so overflowing with plenty. Historians still argue about the true scale and impact of this charitable distribution. Was it a genuinely significant form of social welfare, or more of a symbolic gesture that did little to alleviate widespread poverty? It was likely a bit of both. For those receiving alms, it was undoubtedly a welcome and sometimes crucial source of sustenance. For the king, it was a necessary component of his image as a good and Christian ruler. So, as the great hall slowly empties and the servants begin the massive clean-up, you can imagine the well-organised system for dealing with the remnants of the feast. Wagons or baskets being filled with food for the almoner to distribute, platters being carried back to the kitchens to feed the household staff, and the happy sounds of dogs, and perhaps pigs, enjoying their unexpected bounty. Nothing, or very little, would go to true waste. It would be consumed, shared, or recycled within the complex ecosystem of the medieval royal household and its dependents. The feast, even in its aftermath, continued to sustain and to send a message of royal power and paternal care. The generosity didn't end when the last guest departed. It rippled outwards, a fading echo of the magnificent abundance that had graced the king's table. The last echoes of the minstrel's music have faded from the great hall. The torches are being extinguished one by one, and you, our weary but well-fed guest, are finally stumbling towards your chamber, perhaps guided by a sleepy page. The opulence, the entertainment, the sheer sensory overload of the royal feast are now receding into a pleasant, if slightly hazy, memory. But the feasting experience isn't quite over. Now comes the aftermath, the less glamorous but inevitable consequence of indulging in such a rich and excessive banquet. The morning after, and the medieval digestive system's heroic battle to process it all. If you thought navigating the etiquette was tricky, try navigating the post-feast internal landscape. Let's be frank, medieval feasting, with its mountains of meat, heavy sauces, copious amounts of ale and wine, and surprising sugar load, was not exactly a light meal. Your digestive system, accustomed perhaps to a more modest daily fare, unless you're a permanent fixture at court, in which case your system is probably a battle-hardened veteran, is now facing a monumental task. Think of it as a medieval siege, but happening inside your own personal fortress. The sheer volume of food alone would be a challenge for anyone not blessed with the appetite of a giant, or the metabolism of a hummingbird. Waking up the next morning, you might feel a certain fullness, a distinct lack of desire for roasted swan for breakfast. Your stomach might be staging a rebellion, gurgling and groaning in protest at the diverse and voluminous army it was forced to accommodate the night before. Heartburn, or heart scald as it might have been called, was likely a common companion for many a feaster. Those rich, spicy sauces, the fatty meats, the acidic wines, all prime culprits for igniting that fiery sensation in your chest. You can imagine nobles reaching for various herbal remedies, or simply enduring it with a pained expression, and a vow to eat more moderately next time, a vow likely forgotten by the next feast. And then there's the issue of, well, output. Medieval plumbing, even in a royal castle, was not what we're used to. Guardrobes, essentially stone or wooden latrines built into the castle walls, with a chute leading down to a moat or a cesspit below, were the height of sanitary technology. Privacy was often minimal. Imagine a queue of groaning nobles outside the Royal Guardrobe Tower the morning after a particularly enthusiastic consumption of spiced eel pie. It's not a pretty picture, but it's a realistic one. The night soil men who had the unenviable task of cleaning out those cesspits periodically probably earned every penny of their wages, especially after a major feast. Medieval medicine, based on the theory of the four humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, had its own explanations and remedies for digestive distress. An imbalance of these humours, caused by excessive or inappropriate food and drink, was thought to lead to all sorts of ailments. Physicians might prescribe various concoctions to rebalance the humours. These could include herbal laxatives or purgatives to cleanse the system, if things were feeling a bit sluggish after that third helping of boar. Ingredients like senna, rhubarb, or even more potent substances might be employed. Alternatively, if things were moving a bit too enthusiastically, binding agents like toasted bread, rice, or certain astringent herbs might be recommended. It was all a bit hit and miss, and some remedies were probably worse than the condition they were trying to treat. Feeling a bit queasy after the king's banquet, Sir Reginald? Might I suggest this delightful tisane of boiled nettles and powdered stag beetle? The sheer richness of the food could also lead to more chronic problems for habitual feasters. Gout, as we've mentioned, was the disease of kings for a reason. The high purine content of red meats, offal, and rich seafood, combined with alcohol consumption, could lead to excruciatingly painful attacks of joint inflammation. You can picture a portly baron, his foot propped up on a velvet cushion, cursing the previous night's indulgence in venison pasties and strong ale. It was the medieval equivalent of a really bad hangover, but in your big toe. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval people, especially the wealthy, often suffered from a range of dental problems. The combination of sugary foods, especially with the increasing availability of sugar, and a lack of effective dental hygiene, meant that tooth decay, gum disease, and tooth loss were common. Chewing through some of those tougher medieval meats with a mouthful of aching teeth couldn't have been pleasant. One hopes the hippocras had some numbing qualities. One quirky and somewhat related tidbit concerns the medieval belief in the sweating sickness. This mysterious and often fatal illness appeared in England in several outbreaks, particularly in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. While its exact cause is still debated by medical historians, some suspect a hunter virus, contemporary observers often associated it with rich living and overindulgence. So, waking up with a fever and profuse sweating after a feast might have caused a moment of genuine panic, wondering if you'd contracted something more serious than a simple case of indigestion. Was it the dodgy oysters, or is this the dreaded sweat that carried off Uncle Ethelred? Alcohol, of course, played its part in the morning after experience. The hangovers from medieval ale, wine and mead, especially when consumed in feasting quantities, must have been legendary. headaches, nausea, and a general feeling of being run over by a jousting. Horse would have been common. Again, herbal remedies, or perhaps just a hair of the dog, more ale to ease the pain, would have been the order of the day. Water, if you could find a clean source, was probably your best friend, though it lacked the glamour of another goblet of wine. Historians still argue about the overall life expectancy and health of the medieval aristocracy. While they had access to more food and better living conditions than the peasantry, their rich diet and lifestyle also exposed them to a unique set of health risks. Was the opulence of the feast worth the potential physical toll? For many, the answer was clearly yes, but it came at a price, often paid the morning after, and sometimes in the longer term. So, as you lie in your straw-stuffed mattress, if you're lucky, or on a pallet on the floor, if you're less so, contemplating the internal rumblings and the dull ache behind your eyes, you gain a new appreciation for the resilience of the medieval constitution. The feast was a glorious assault on the senses, but also a formidable challenge to the body. It's a reminder that behind the glittering spectacle of the royal banquet lay some very human, and sometimes very uncomfortable biological realities. Perhaps a light breakfast of plain porridge and a cup of weak herbal tea is in order. And maybe a long walk. A very long walk. The morning after groans have subsided, the guardrobes have seen their fair share of activity, and you've perhaps even managed a small, sensible breakfast, swearing off roasted swan for at least a week. As the full reality of the previous night's magnificent indulgence settles in, both in your memory and your digestive tract, it's time to step back and consider the bigger picture, the true cost of such a royal feast. We've marvelled at the opulence, the variety, the sheer scale of it all. But behind every gilded peacock and every flagon of Hippocras lay an immense expenditure of resources, labour, and environmental impact, a cost that rippled far beyond the castle walls. Think, first, of the sheer human effort involved. We've glimpsed the Royal Kitchen Brigade, a veritable army of cooks, scullions, bakers and butchers toiling in the heat and smoke. But their labour was just the tip of the iceberg. Consider the huntsmen who braved the forest to procure the game, risking injury or worse. The farmers and peasants who tilled the fields, tended the livestock and harvested the grains and vegetables, a portion of which was destined for the king's table, often through the unpopular system of purveyance or as feudal dues. The drovers who guided herds of cattle and sheep across long distances, the fishermen who cast their nets in rivers and seas, the woodcutters who felled trees for the constantly burning fires in the kitchens and the great hall, the carters and boatmen who transported all these provisions, often over rough roads and unpredictable waterways, the vintners and brewers who crafted the wine and ale, the weavers who made the linen for the tablecloths and napkins, the potters and silversmiths who fashioned the dishes and goblets. The list is almost endless. A single royal feast represented the concentrated labour of thousands of individuals, many of whom would never even catch a glimpse of the splendours they helped create. Then there's the financial cost. Spices, as we know, were worth more than gold. Imported wines, sugar, fine silks for clothing and tapestries, these were all luxury goods that drained the royal coffers. Even domestically produced items, when required in such vast quantities, represented a significant economic outlay. While the king might acquire some goods through feudal obligations or purveyance, which often meant delayed or below market payment, effectively a form of taxation, many other items had to be purchased outright. Hosting frequent and lavish feasts was a serious drain on the royal treasury. Maintaining the image of magnificence was an expensive business. One mainstream historical fact is that medieval monarchs often found themselves in debt, partly due to the cost of warfare, but also significantly due to the expenses of maintaining a lavish court and hosting events like these feasts. Royal accountants must have had perpetual headaches trying to balance the books when entertainment involved roasting several oxen and buying cinnamon by the pound. Beyond the human and financial costs, consider the environmental impact, a concept perhaps not at the forefront of medieval consciousness, but very real nonetheless. The demand for firewood to fuel the kitchens and heat the halls led to significant deforestation in some areas. The intensive hunting required to supply the royal table with game could, over time, deplete local wildlife populations, despite the strict forest laws designed to protect them for the king's pleasure. The expansion of agriculture to feed the growing population and supply the demands of the elite also had an impact on the landscape. clearing forests and altering ecosystems. While perhaps not on the scale of modern industrial environmental damage, the medieval world was by no means a pristine, untouched wilderness, and the demands of a feasting culture certainly played their part. It's a sobering thought that glorious roasted venison represented not just a hunting triumph, but also a small piece of a changing landscape. The transportation of goods also had a footprint. Roads were often poor, requiring teams of oxen or horses to pull heavy wagons, consuming fodder and contributing to wear and tear. River transport, while more efficient, still required the construction and maintenance of boats and barges. The sheer logistics of moving so much material from source to castle was a major undertaking, with an associated energy cost, even if it was primarily animal and human power. There was also a social cost, arguably. The vast disparity between the lavish consumption at the king's table and the often meagre existence of the peasantry, who produced much of the food, could breed resentment. While charity and largesse were practiced, as we've seen, the fundamental inequality was stark. The feast was a display of power, and part of that power was the ability to command and consume resources on a scale utterly unimaginable to the common person. It reinforced the social order, yes, but it also highlighted the vast gulf between the rulers and the ruled. Historians still argue about the extent to which such conspicuous consumption contributed to social stability, by awing the populace and demonstrating the ruler's capacity, versus social tension, by highlighting inequality. It was a delicate balance, and sometimes it tipped. A quirky and rather ironic consideration is the waste of valuable labour on purely ephemeral creations. Think of the hours spent by skilled confectioners crafting an elaborate sugar subtlety that would be admired for an hour and then perhaps broken up. While it served a purpose in terms of display and prestige, from a purely utilitarian standpoint, it was an incredible expenditure of skill and expensive ingredients on something fleeting. But of course, utility wasn't the primary driver. Status and spectacle were. It's like complaining that a fireworks display is a waste of gunpowder. You're missing the point of the show. The true cost of a medieval royal feast, then, was far greater than just the bill for groceries. It was a complex equation involving human lives and labour, economic resources, environmental impact, and social implications. It was the price of power, the cost of maintaining an image of magnificence and authority in a world where such displays were a vital tool of governance. As you reflect on the splendour you witnessed, remember the vast, largely unseen machinery that made it all possible. The feast was not just a meal, it was an economic and social phenomenon, a focal point for the energies and resources of an entire kingdom. It was, in every sense of the word, a royal production, with a royal price tag to match. The memory of the flavours and the spectacle might fade, but the understanding of its profound and multifaceted cost should linger, a final, sobering course in our journey through the world of medieval royal feasting. And as our exploration of these grand historical banquets draws to a close, perhaps you find your eyelids growing a little heavier, the thought of spiced wine and roasted meats lulling you into a state of pleasant drowsiness. The great hall, once so vibrant with music and laughter, now recedes into the quiet shadows of your imagination. The flickering torchlight softens, the distant clatter from the kitchens fades, and the rich tapestries on the walls seem to blur into comforting patterns. You've walked through the royal forests, peeked into the bustling kitchens, marvelled at the laden tables, and even considered the morning after. It has been a long and hopefully fascinating journey. Now, let the gentle weight of history settle around you like a warm blanket. There are no more courses to anticipate, no more complex rules of etiquette to remember. There is only the soft murmur of the past, a gentle whisper inviting you to rest. Let your mind drift, let the images of bygone splendours become soft and hazy, and allow yourself to sink into a deep and peaceful sleep.